Close your eyes.
Let your shoulders drop.
Let the tension leave your jaw.
Imagine you are standing in the deep darkness of a medieval night. The world outside is silent.
The village is asleep. There is no electric hum. There are no streetlights. Just the heavy blanket of the night sky and the cold earth beneath your feet.
But in front of you there is a glow. An orange breathing light that spills out from a wide doorway.
It pulses like a heartbeat. You step closer. You feel the temperature change on your skin. The air grows dry. The smell of sulfur and charcoal fills your nose.
Welcome to the forge. We are going to spend a long time here. We are going to explore every shadow,
every scar,
every strike of the hammer. Being a blacksmith in the Middle Ages was not just a job.
It was a life of brutal endurance. It was a life of fire and iron. But tonight we are safe. Tonight we are just watching.
We are just listening to the story of the iron and the men who bent it to their will.
Let us begin by understanding the heat. You might think you know what heat feels like. You might know the feeling of a summer day or opening a hot oven. But the heat of the forge was a living thing.
It was a beast that the blacksmith lived with every single day. To melt iron or to make it soft enough to shape requires temperatures that the human body was never meant to endure. We are talking about 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is over 1000 degrees Celsius. It is a heat so intense that it glows white. It is a heat that you can feel from across the room. Imagine standing next to that fire.
Not for a minute, not for an hour,
but from before the sun rises until long after it sets. The medieval blacksmith did not have a thermostat. He did not have a fan. He had only his leather apron and his endurance. The heat was a physical weight.
It pressed against the chest.
It dried out the eyes.
It turned the skin red and raw. In the height of summer, the forge became an oven. The walls of the shop were usually made of stone or timber. They held the heat inside. There was no escape.
Sweat did not just drip.
It poured. It soaked through the linen tunic instantly.
It stubbed the eyes. Dehydration was a constant companion.
A silent enemy. The blacksmith drank gallons of water or weak ale just to stay upright.
If he stopped drinking, the headache would start. A throbbing pain behind the eyes, then the dizziness. If a blacksmith fainted, he might fall. And to fall in a forge was to fall into danger. Hot iron, burning coals,
heavy tools. The floor was hard-packed dirt. It had to be. Wood would burn. Stone would crack from the heat or be slippery with dust. The dirt was dark and stained with years of soot.
It absorbed the sweat of generations.
Let us look at the fire itself,
the heart of the operation. It is beautiful in a terrifying way.
The coals glow red at the edges and white in the center. The bellows feed it air.
Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. It is a rhythmic sound.
The lungs of the shop.
The apprentice pulls the lever of the bellows.
He is young.
Perhaps 12 or 13.
His arms ache, but he cannot stop.
If the air stops, the fire dies. If the fire dies, the iron hardens. If the iron hardens, the work is ruined.
So he pulls.
Whoosh, whoosh. The blacksmith watches the color of the metal.
This requires a master's eye. There were no thermometers. There were no digital readouts. There was only color.
A dull red meant the iron was just waking up.
It was hot but stubborn. A cherry red meant it was ready for simple bending.
An orange glow meant it was pliable. It was ready to move.
A bright yellow meant it was near melting. It was dangerous. If you hit it too hard, it might splatter. And white. White heat was the edge of destruction. It was the point where the metal became liquid. To judge these colors, the blacksmith needed dim light. This is why forges were often dark places, even in the middle of the day.
If the sun shone too brightly into the shop, it would wash out the colors of the glowing metal.
The blacksmith would be blind to the temperature. He would burn the steel. So he worked in the shadows.
He worked in a cave of his own making.
Imagine the strain on the eyes,
staring into the heart of a fire for hours. The infrared radiation cooking the lenses of the eyes over years.
Many old blacksmiths suffered from cataracts.
Their vision blurred and clouded like frosted glass. It was the price they paid for the fire.
But let us step back from the fire for a moment. Let us look at the tools. The hammer. It sits on the anvil. It looks simple. A block of iron on a wooden handle.
But pick it up.
Feel the weight of it.
A standard hand hammer might weigh 2 or 3 pounds. That does not sound like much. Lift a bag of sugar. It is light.
But now imagine lifting that bag of sugar over your head and bringing it down with force.
A blacksmith would strike the anvil thousands of times a day.
10,000 strikes.
20,000 strikes.
The vibration travels up the handle.
It moves into the hand.
It travels up the wrist, into the forearm, into the elbow, into the shoulder.
Every single strike sends a shockwave through the skeleton.
Over time, this destroyed the body. The joints would swell. The cartilage would wear away. The hands of a medieval blacksmith were not just calloused. They were often permanently curved. The fingers locked into the shape of the hammer handle.
The grip strength was immense, but the dexterity was gone. They could crush an apple with one hand, but they might struggle to button a shirt.
This condition is brutal. The repetitive motion caused microfractures in the bones.
It caused tendinitis that never healed because there was no rest.
If you did not work, you did not eat. The village needed horseshoes.
The lord needed weapons.
The farmer needed plowshares. The hammer could not stop.
The anvil itself has a sound, a high-pitched ring.
Ping, ping, ping. Today, we know that loud noises damage hearing.
We wear a protection. We have safety laws. The medieval blacksmith had none of these. He stood directly over the source of the sound. That high-frequency ring of metal on metal is incredibly damaging. It pierces the eardrum.
Day after day,
Year after year.
most older blacksmiths were deaf.
Or nearly so.
They lived in a world of muffled sounds. They could feel the vibration of the hammer, but they could no longer hear the birds sing.
They could no longer hear the whisper of their children.
The silence of the world outside the forge grew louder as their hearing faded.
It was a solitary brutality.
Let us consider the air in the room.
Take a deep breath now. The air you are breathing is likely clean. It is cool.
In the forge, the air was thick. It was heavy with particulate matter, coal dust,
Charcoal dust.
metal filings, smoke.
Every time the hammer struck, hot iron sparks flew.
These are tiny pieces of burning metal.
They cool as they fall and turn into dust.
This dust floats in the air.
Every time the bellows pumped, ash rose from the fire. The blacksmith breathed this in.
There was no ventilation system, just a hole in the roof or a chimney that worked poorly. The lungs of a blacksmith were black, not pink.
They were coated in carbon. Many suffered from a cough that never went away. A hacking dry cough that shook their frames in the middle of the night.
It was called the black lung in later centuries, but in the Middle Ages it was just the cost of the trade.
It shortened their lives. It made breathing a struggle in their later years.
And yet they were essential. This is the paradox of the brutal life of the blacksmith. They destroyed their bodies to build the world. Without the blacksmith, there is no agriculture.
The plowshare turns the earth.
The scythe harvests the wheat. The axe clears the forest.
All made of iron.
All made in the heat. Without the blacksmith, there is no transportation. The horse needs shoes to walk on hard roads.
The wagon needs iron tires for its wheels.
The nails hold the cart together. Without the blacksmith, there is no construction. The hinges on the cathedral doors, the nails in the roof beams, the tools of the stonemasons. Without the blacksmith, there is no protection. The sword, the helmet,
The chainmail. The arrowheads.
the blacksmith carried the weight of civilization on his burning shoulders. Let us move closer to the anvil again. Watch the process of shaping.
The iron comes out of the fire glowing orange.
The blacksmith places it on the face of the anvil.
He has seconds. Literally seconds. As soon as the metal touches the cold air, it begins to cool.
As soon as it touches the cold anvil, it loses heat rapidly. He must strike now. He must strike accurately. If he hits it at the wrong angle, the metal bends the wrong way.
He cannot simply erase the mistake. He has to heat it up again.
He has to hammer it back. This wastes fuel. This wastes time. This wastes the metal itself as layers flake off in the fire.
This is called scale. So he must be precise while using extreme force. Imagine trying to thread a needle while running a marathon.
That is the level of focus required.
Physical exhaustion combined with the need for delicate accuracy. He holds the hot iron with tongs in his left hand.
The tongs are heavy. The iron is heavy.
He must rotate the piece constantly.
Turn, strike, turn, strike, turn, strike. The coordination is mesmerizing.
It is a dance. A violent, beautiful dance. But look at his arms.
Look at the scars. Every blacksmith has burns.
It is unavoidable.
A spark efflies and lands on the arm. It sizzles. The blacksmith does not flinch. He cannot. If he flinches, he misses the strike. So he lets it burn.
He shakes it off later.
Sometimes a piece of hot scale efflies into the boot.
It burns against the ankle.
He works through the pain. Sometimes the iron slips. A heavy bar of glowing steel falls against the leg. These are deep burns. They take weeks to heal. In the Middle Ages, infection was a death sentence. A bad burn could fester.
It could turn gangrenous.
The blacksmith used salve made of animal fat or herbs.
He wrapped it in linen.
And he went back to work.
The heat of the fire probably helped keep some infections at bay by cauterizing the air, but the risk was always there.
The smell of singed hair and burnt skin was not uncommon in the forge. It mingled with the smell of coal and sweat. We must also talk about the strength required. Not just arm strength,
but core strength, back strength, leg strength.
The blacksmith stands all day. He does not sit.
To get power into the blow, he does not just use his arm. He uses his legs.
He drops his weight.
He twists his torso.
Lower back pain was universal.
The discs in the spine compressed under the constant load. The knees ground down. By the time a blacksmith was 40 years old, he often moved like an old man. His body was stiff, his joints cracked.
He was used up.
But there was a pride in this brutality. The blacksmith was often the most respected man in the village. He was sometimes feared. People believed there was magic in the forge.
How could a man take a rock from the earth and turn it into a sword? How could he master the element of fire which everyone else feared?
They whispered that blacksmiths had secret knowledge. They thought the water in the cooling trough had healing properties because the hot iron had been quenched in it. People would come to the forge to drink the iron water, hoping it would cure their ailments.
The blacksmith knew it was not magic. It was sweat. It was pain. It was knowledge passed down from master to apprentice. The apprentice, let us look at him in the corner. He is the future of the trade.
But his life is arguably even harder than the master's. He is essentially a servant. He wakes up before the master to light the fire.
He chops the charcoal. He sweeps the floor. He pumps the bellows until his arms feel like they will fall off. He is not allowed to touch the expensive iron yet. He watches. He learns by absorbing the rhythm. He gets the scraps of food. He sleeps on the floor of the forge in the winter for warmth. If he makes a mistake, he is beaten. Not out of cruelty necessarily, but out of necessity.
Iron is expensive. Charcoal is expensive.
A mistake costs the master money he does not have. The discipline is absolute. The apprentice learns to tolerate the heat. He learns to ignore the burns. He learns to swing the sledgehammer. The sledgehammer is the big hammer.
The master uses the small hammer to indicate where to hit. He taps the hot iron.
The apprentice swings the heavy sledgehammer and strikes that exact spot. This requires immense trust. The master is holding the iron.
His hands are inches away from where the apprentice swings a 10-pound hammer with full force. It is hypnotic. It echoes through the valley.
It tells the village that the work is continuing, that life is continuing.
As the sun begins to set, the work does not stop.
In the winter, the days are short. The blacksmith works by the light of the fire and perhaps a tallow candle. The shadows lengthen. The forge becomes a place of high contrast. Deep blacks and glowing reds. The exhaustion sets in deep now. The muscles are depleted of glycogen. The mind is foggy.
This is the dangerous time. When you are tired, you make mistakes.
But the order must be finished. The night is leaving in the morning.
The horse must be shod.
So the blacksmith reaches deep into a reserve of energy that only hardened workers possess. He splashes water on his face. The water hisses as it hits his hot skin. This was the reality.
It was not a hobby.
It was not a weekend craft.
It was a battle for survival fought with fire and iron. And this is only the beginning of our understanding.
We have only just stepped inside the door. We have only just felt the first wave of heat.
There are so many more layers to this life.
The mining of the ore, the making of the charcoal, the specific tools for specific jobs, the weapons of war, the tools of peace, the social standing, the guilds, the secrets. We will explore all of them.
We will take our time. There is no rush. The fire is warm.
The shadows are long.
To understand the brutality of the forge, we must understand where the iron comes from. It does not appear by magic.
It is not delivered in neat, clean bars. In the medieval world, getting the metal was a battle against the earth itself. Let us leave the forge for a moment.
Let us walk out into the mist of a medieval morning.
The air is damp.
The ground is soft. We are walking towards a swamp.
A bog. This is where the story of the sword begins. Not in a castle, but in the mud. Much of the iron used in the darker ages and the early medieval period was bog iron. It is a gift from the bacteria in the water. These microscopic creatures live in the roots of plants in the swamps. They take iron from the water and concentrate it. They build little nodules.
Little rocks of rust imagine the job of the iron collector.
It is autumn. The water is freezing. A thin layer of ice might form at the edges of the pools in the morning. You have no waterproof boots.
You have leather wrapped around your feet, but the water soaks through instantly. You step into the bog. The mud sucks at your ankles.
It tries to pull you down. The smell is thick. It smells of decaying leaves. It smells of old stagnant water. It smells of the earth rotting and being reborn. You carry a spear with a metal tip. You poke the mud.
You are listening with your hands.
You are feeling for a clunk. Soft mud. Soft mud. Root. Soft mud.
Clunk. There it is.
You reach down.
You plunge your arm into the freezing black water.
You cannot see. You have to feel. Your fingers go numb within seconds. You grapple with the mud until you find a rock.
You pull it up. It drips with slime. It looks like a rusty potato. It is heavy. This is the treasure.
This is the iron ore. You throw it in a basket on your back. And you do it again. And again. Your skin turns white and wrinkled from the water.
Your back aches from bending over.
The cold seeps into your bones.
It is a wet cold, the kind of cold that stays with you even when you are near a fire later.
This was the first brutality. The extraction, to gather enough or to make a single axe head, might take days of wading in the swamp. To make a suit of armor might take a season of harvest. The men who did this were often farmers in the off-season.
They traded their comfort for these heavy wet rocks.
But the ore is useless without fuel. You cannot melt rock with a normal campfire. You need heat.
Intense heat.
So we leave the swamp and we walk into the forest.
Deep in the woods we find the charcoal burner. He is a mysterious figure. He lives apart from the village. He lives in a hut made of branches and moss.
He is always covered in dust. He is black from head to toe. Wood burns too fast. If you put raw wood in a forge, it burns up and the heat fluctuates. It contains water and sap.
It smokes.
It is not pure.
The blacksmith needs charcoal.
Charcoal is wood that has been cooked. All the water and gases have been removed. It is pure carbon.
It burns hot and clean, but making it is a delicate and exhausting art. The charcoal burner cuts down the trees.
Oak is best, or beech.
Hardwoods. He chops them into uniform lengths. He builds a pile, a carefully constructed mound of wood. It looks like a cone. He covers this mound with turf and wet earth. He packs it tight. He wants to seal it, then he lights a fire inside.
He does not want the wood to burn to ash. He wants it to bake.
He needs to control the air perfectly. If too much air gets in, the wood turns to ash and he loses everything. If too little air gets in, the fire goes out, so he watches.
He watches the smoke. White smoke means it is drying.
This is good. Blue smoke means it is carbonizing.
This is perfect. Black smoke means it is burning.
This is bad.
He must cover the whole quickly. This process takes days.
3 days.
4 days.
Sometimes a week.
The charcoal burner cannot sleep. If the wind changes while he is asleep, the pile might catch fire and burn down. He has to be awake.
He walks around the mound.
He touches it to feel the heat. He listens to the cracking inside. He is a slave to the mound. He naps for 10 minutes here.
20 minutes there. He is perpetually exhausted. His lungs are filled with the fine dust of the charcoal.
His eyes are red from the smoke. He is a lonely man. But he is essential.
Without him, the blacksmith has no fire. Without him, the knight has no sword. When the burn is finished, he rakes out the black gold.
The charcoal.
It is light. It rings like china when you tap two pieces together.
It is pure fuel. Now we have the ore from the swamp.
We have the charcoal from the forest. Now they must meet.
They meet in the bloomery. The bloomery is a chimney made of clay and stone. It stands about as tall as a man.
It is the ancestor of the blast furnace. The workers fill the chimney.
A layer of charcoal. A layer of bog iron. A layer of charcoal.
A layer of bog iron. They light it.
They seal the door. And now the pumping begins. Just like in the forge, the bloomery needs air.
It needs huge bellows.
These are often worked by water wheels in later periods, but often by men or animals in the earlier times. The temperature climbs. It needs to reach huge heights.
But here is a secret of the medieval iron maker.
They could rarely get the fire hot enough to actually melt the iron completely. Liquid iron requires over 1,500 degrees Celsius.
The primitive bloomery could usually only reach about 1,200 or 1,300, so the iron does not turn into a soup. It turns into a sponge.
The rock melts. The silica and the dirt melt into a liquid glass called slag. This drips down to the bottom, but the iron stays solid.
It gets sticky. It clumps together. After hours and hours of burning, the workers break open the clay door. The heat blasts out.
It is blinding. They use great tongs to pull out the result.
It is a glowing ball.
It looks like a dirty snowball made of fire. This is called a bloom. It is ugly.
It is rough.
It is filled with pockets of liquid glass and charcoal and dirt. It is not steel yet.
It is barely iron.
This is where the brutality of consolidation begins. The bloom is heavy.
Maybe 50 pounds.
Maybe more.
It is dripping with liquid slag while it is still white hot. They must beat it. They drag it to a great wooden stump or a large stone.
Men with heavy wooden mallets or iron sledges begin to pound it. Smash, smash, smash.
They are squeezing the sponge.
Just like squeezing water out of a bathroom sponge, they are squeezing the liquid glass slag out of the iron. Molten lava squirts out with every hit.
It is dangerous. It sprays across the room.
They have to hit hard. They have to hit fast. The bloom is cooling. If it gets too cold, the slag hardens inside the iron and ruins it.
So they work in a frenzy. The sweat pours.
The muscles scream.
This is heavy labor.
This is not a precise tapping of the sword maker. This is raw force. They heat it up again.
They beat it again. They fold it over. They beat it again. Slowly the ball becomes a bar.
The impurities are driven out. The iron becomes solid. This iron is known as wrought iron.
It is tough.
It is fibrous. It has a grain like wood. This is the material that finally arrives at the blacksmith's door. Think of the journey this piece of metal has taken before the blacksmith even touches it. It was sleeping in the cold mud for centuries. It was dug up by freezing hands. It was cooked by the lonely charcoal
burner. It was roasted in the bloomery. It was beaten by the sledgehammers. And now it sits on the floor of the smithy.
A rough dark bar of potential. The blacksmith looks at it. He knows the cost of it. He knows that men bled and froze and burned to get this bar to him. He cannot waste it. He picks it up. He tests its weight. Now he must understand the quality of the iron.
Not all iron is the same. Some iron is soft.
It bends easily. It is good for nails or horseshoes. Some iron is hard.
It is brittle.
If you hit it too hard, it might crack. And then there is skill. Steel was a mystery to the medieval mind.
They knew that sometimes if you cooked the iron in charcoal for a long time, it became harder.
It could hold a sharp edge.
We know today that this is because carbon atoms from the charcoal migrate into the crystal structure of the iron. It makes the metal stronger.
But to them it was almost alchemy.
Steel was rare. Steel was expensive. A blacksmith might have a pile of soft iron and a tiny precious bar of steel. When making a knife, he would not make the whole thing out of steel.
That would be a waste. Instead, he would use the soft iron for the back of the blade, the spine. This gave the knife flexibility. It would not snap. Then he would take a thin strip of that precious steel.
He would weld it onto the edge.
This process is called forge welding.
It is one of the most difficult skills a blacksmith must master. Let us watch him try to do it. He takes the soft iron bar and the hard steel strip.
He puts them in the fire. He watches the color. If the metal is too cold, the pieces will not stick together.
They will just bounce off each other. If the metal is too hot, the steel will burn. It will sparkle and disintegrate like a sparkler on a holiday. The carbon will burn out and the steel will be ruined. He needs the exact moment when the surface of the metal is wet.
It looks like it is sweating.
He sprinkles sand on it. This is called flux.
The sand melts and creates a glass shield over the metal. It protects it from the oxygen in the air.
If oxygen gets in, it creates rust and the weld will fail.
He pulls the pieces out.
They are white hot.
They are dripping with molten glass. He puts them on the anvil. He must hit firmly, but not too hard.
He needs to fuse them. He needs to trick the two pieces of metal into thinking they are one piece. He hammers them together.
The sparks fly. The liquid glass squirts out.
If he has done it right, the seam disappears. The soft iron and the hard steel are now married. They are one body. If he has failed, the pieces fall apart.
The steel is wasted. The time is wasted. The frustration of a failed weld is immense. You can feel the tension in the room.
The blacksmith might curse under his breath,
but he cannot stop. He has to start over. This was the daily pressure. The materials were inconsistent. The tools were primitive.
The result had to be perfect.
Let us take a moment to consider the physical space of the forge again.
We talked about the heat.
But what about the floor? The floor is a landscape of hazards. There are scraps of sharp metal everywhere. These are the trimmings. When a blacksmith cuts a piece of hot iron, the offcut falls to the ground.
It is still 1000 degrees. If you step on it in thin leather soles, you will burn your foot. If you trip, you might land on the anvil or the fire. The blacksmith moves with a specific gait.
He shuffles. He does not lift his feet high. He feels the floor. He knows where every obstacle is. The air is filled with the smell of sulfur. This comes from the coal.
Sulfur is a poison.
Breathing it day after day creates a metallic taste in the mouth.
It ruins the appetite. Many blacksmiths were thin, lean,
wary.
They did not have the belly of the innkeeper or the soft hands of the scribe. They were consumed by their trade. And yet the forge was a gathering place. In the winter, it was the warmest place in the village. People would come to stand near the door. To soak up the heat, they would watch the blacksmith work.
They would gossip. The blacksmith heard everything.
He knew whose horse was lame. He knew whose plough was broken. He knew who was leaving for war. He was the anchor of the community. But while they talked, he worked. He could not stop to chat.
He could not.
He could grunt.
But the rhythm of the hammer had to continue. Ping, ping,
clang, the sound of the village heartbeat. Imagine the vibration in his bones as the evening sets in.
The day has been long. He has welded the steel to the iron.
He has shaped the tool. His hands are black with soot. The soot is worked into the cracks of his skin. It never really washes out. It becomes a tattoo of his trade. He dips his hands in the cooling trough.
The water is warm now. It has cooled hot iron all day. It feels soothing on his aching joints. He looks at the pile of finished work. A row of nails, a hinge, a knife blade. They are rough.
They are handmade. They have the marks of the hammer on them. These marks are like a signature. In the modern world, everything is smooth.
Everything is identical. A machine makes it. In the medieval world, every object was unique.
You could see the struggle in the metal.
You could see where the hammer hit a little harder.
You could see the grain of the iron. The blacksmith wipes his face with a rag.
The rag is dirty too. Everything is dirty here, but there is a purity in the dirt. It is honest dirt. He banks the fire. He piles ash over the coals to keep them sleeping until morning. He cannot let the fire go out completely. Starting it from scratch is too much work. So he puts the fire to sleep. The orange glow fades to a dull red. The shadows consume the room. The heat remains. The stones of the wall radiate the warmth back into the night. The blacksmith steps out into the cool night air.
The contrast is shocking.
The sweat on his skin turns cold. He shivers. He walks home.
His body aches.
His ears ring. But he knows that tomorrow the iron will be waiting. The bog iron, the charcoal, the bloom. It is a cycle that does not end. As you drift deeper into relaxation, think of that cycle. The task of the medieval farrier, which was an integrated skill set belonging entirely to the blacksmith of the time, was a terrifying and intimate transaction performed not with dead, inanimate metal, but with 1,000 pounds of nervous, powerful muscle and bone that could,
with a sudden reflexive kick in the dark confines of the forge, shatter a man's jaw, break his ribs, or end his career and his life entirely, creating a high-stakes scenario where calm technique was always a necessary counterpoint to overwhelming physical threat.
Imagine this huge animal, the great warhorse or the heavy draft horse that pulls the plow, being led into the blacksmith's small, smoky domain, where the flickering light and the unfamiliar smells of burning horn and hot metal only serve to heighten the creature's anxiety, despite the reassuring
low murmurs of the master who knew that a sudden movement could turn the horse into a lethal weapon.
The initial process required the blacksmith to approach the horse with a delicate, practiced confidence, speaking softly while running his hands down the animal's powerful leg, feeling for any signs of swelling or injury, before gently lifting the heavy hoof, which felt like a massive stone in his hands, requiring him to brace his own weight against the horse's sheer bulk to maintain control. Once the hoof was secured between his knees or resting on a supporting stand, the farrier had to use specialized, razor-sharp tools, like the hoof knife and the rasp, to clean away the old, dead material, trimming the tough, dense horn back to the correct weight-bearing shape, a necessary act of surgery that demanded absolute precision, knowing that cutting just a millimeter too deep could draw blood and inflict agonizing lameness upon an animal whose mobility meant the difference between a successful harvest or a last battle. After carefully inspecting the prepared hoof, the blacksmith would turn back to the fire, where he had already shaped the iron bar into the rough curve of the horseshoe, a semi-finished object that he now had to refine by reheating it in the intense coals until it glowed a rich,
vibrant orange, ensuring the iron was malleable enough to be precisely fitted to the unique contour of the horse's foot, while still retaining its structural integrity against the immense forces it would later endure on rocky roads or fields.
The most intense part of this demanding process involved the hot fitting, where the blacksmith would briefly and quickly press the glowing hot shoe against the prepared hoof, creating a cloud of foul, acrid smoke and the distinctive, sizzling smell of burning horn, which was crucial for sterilizing the hoof and providing an exact, charcoal-blackened template for the final fit, but which also often terrified the horse and filled the forge with an odor that spoke volumes about the violence of the trade. He then had to return the hot shoe to the anvil one last time, making minute adjustments with quick, sure hammer strikes to ensure the fit was flawless, understanding that even the slightest imbalance in the finished shoe could cause an unnatural gait, leading to chronic pain or injury that would render a valuable animal completely useless for the demanding work required by the medieval economy. The final stage, which tested the nerve and skill of the farrier, was the act of nailing the finished shoe into the insensitive outer wall of the hoof, using long, sharp, specially designed nails that had to be driven at a precise angle, following a specific path through the thick horn, and then emerging cleanly on the side, where the blacksmith would twist of the pointed end and clinch it tightly against the hoof wall, a task that needed immense concentration, because striking the sensitive inner tissues, the quick was an immediate injury that could lead to crippling infection and potentially earn the farrier a devastating kick. This constant bending and holding of the massive horse leg, put an extraordinary and unusual strain on the blacksmith's spine and legs, forcing him into awkward, compromised positions that invited injury. And the constant threat of the animal shifting its weight or panicking in the heat meant that the farrier could never truly relax, maintaining a constant, low-level vigilance that exhausted the nervous system as much as the muscles. Furthermore, the medieval blacksmith was responsible not only for the common, everyday horses, but also for the highly prized, exceptionally valuable destriers and great horses of the knightly class, which were worth the price of a small farm, meaning that any mistake in the shoeing process was not just a physical failure, but a catastrophic economic and military blunder that could result in severe social and financial penalties from the unforgiving feudal lord. The farrier's tools, from the heavy, blunt claw of the shoeing hammer to the curved, sharp blade of the hoof parer, became extensions of his own scarred hands, each movement a practiced, efficient gesture developed over years of agonizing trial and error, a silent language spoken between the man and the beast that allowed the work to be completed without excessive force or fear, although the possibility of failure was always a hot, heavy presence in the air. Beyond the actual shoeing, the blacksmith was often the only person capable of rudimentary veterinary care, called upon to diagnose and treat various hoof ailments, from thrush caused by damp stables to stone bruises hidden beneath the hardened sole, forcing him to act as an uncertified, on-the-spot healer, using poultices of mixed herbs and hot irons for cauterization, adding another layer of heavy responsibility to his already immense workload. The heat also played its unrelenting role here, not only in the preparation of the shoe, but in the sheer physical exertion required to wrestle with a horse while standing next to a roaring forge in the middle of a hot afternoon, compounding the danger of the physical labor with the debilitating effects of dehydration and thermal exhaustion, turning the shoeing process into a genuine test of human endurance against both animal and element. It is important to remember that these massive animals were not domesticated in the modern sense. They possessed a wild energy that was barely contained by the tack and the rider, and the blacksmith, standing underneath them, was the one person who had to momentarily subdue that innate power through sheer will and deep knowledge of animal behavior. A profound moment of human dominance over nature repeated countless times throughout the medieval centuries. The successful shoeing of a horse, completed without injury to the animal or the man, was an immensely satisfying achievement that confirmed the blacksmith's essential status, cementing his reputation as a master of both fire and flesh. A man whose hands could bring life back to a lame animal or prepare a noble steed for the trials of the coming crusade, a dual role that elevated him above the simple tradesmen of the village. When the work was done and the final nail clinched, the blacksmith would gently lower the animal's leg, watching the horse take its first steps on the new iron shoes, listening for the clear, solid clack of metal on stone that signaled a successful job. A sound that was a temporary, low-toned sigh of relief that would quickly be replaced by the rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil, as he immediately turned back to the hundreds of other iron demands awaiting his attention. We can appreciate that the quiet focus required for this dangerous work, the slow, deliberate movements, the soft, soothing tone used for the agitated animal, and the almost meditative attention to detail formed a unique, highly pressured carve within the forge, a necessary mental discipline that allowed the blacksmith to survive his proximity to both the 1,000-degree heat and the 1,000-pound kick. This chapter in the blacksmith's life closes with the smell of scorched horn and warm leather slowly drifting out of the forge, leaving behind the powerful realization that the strength required for this trade was not merely in the swing of the hammer, but in the patience and control necessary to master both the yielding iron and the resistant living animal. As the image of the great horse slowly fades from the mind's eye, and we hear only the steady, deep breathing of the forge fire, we prepare to examine the tools of war, the cold, lethal necessities that the blacksmith was most famous for creating, a task that required an entirely different, more mystical application of his fiery skills. After mastering the humble but essential horseshoe, the medieval blacksmith often turned his attention to the creation that most deeply intertwined his physical labor with the era's grand narratives and dangerous realities. The sword, an object of immense symbolic power that represented the very nature of feudal authority and the lethal stakes of the medieval world, demanding an altogether different, almost sacred, kind of precision and understanding of the metal's soul. The challenge of the blade lay not simply in the hammering, which was intense, but in the metallurgical knowledge required to coax hard,
life taking edges out of the inconsistent and impure iron derived from the primitive bloomeries we discussed earlier, a process that was part science, part art, and, to the uninitiated, seemed entirely like sorcery performed by a man wreathed in smoke and fire. To begin the forging of a proper sword, the blacksmith first had to manage the incredibly difficult task of creating steel, the metal that could hold an edge, which involved taking his best pieces of wrought iron, the fibrous,
soft stuff, and deliberately heating them for days in a sealed box with powdered charcoal, hoping that the carbon would slowly permeate the iron surface in a secret process called cauterization, which could increase the metal's hardness, but also introduce the immense risk of turning the entire precious piece brittle and useless.
the most famous and complex method used for high-quality blades, particularly in the earlier medieval period before widespread access to crucible steel, was pattern welding, a technique that stands as a testament to the blacksmith's ingenuity and willingness to endure staggering labor for a superior result, and which involved taking alternating strips of soft iron and hard, higher carbon steel, bundling them together like a piece of wood, and then forge welding the whole mass into a single cohesive billet.
This billet was then elongated under the powerful strokes of the sledgehammer, folded in half, forge welded again, and then hammered out and folded once more, an act of repetitive violence against the metal that served a dual purpose. First, it physically drove out impurities and homogenized the inconsistent material, making the final metal stronger and tougher, and second, it layered the iron and steel perhaps dozens or even hundreds of times, creating an internal grain-like wood that could absorb the shock of battle without snapping. Imagine the sheer physical stamina required for this process, which could involve 40 or 50 welding heats for a single sword, meaning the blacksmith had to hold a heavy, flowing billet in and out of the fire, hammer it down with incredible speed and force while the heat was perfect,
twist it, fold it, and then repeat the cycle immediately, all while fighting of the thermal exhaustion that threatened to collapse him onto the earthen floor.
The final unfolding of these repeated layers created the beautiful, swirling, wave-like patterns visible on the finished blade, the famous lines that were often mistaken for a magical inscription or a sign of divine favor, but which were, in reality, the topographical map of the blacksmith's long, brutal, and skilled labor.
A visible record of every fold and every hammer strike that went into creating the blade's incredible strength and resilience. Once the pattern-welded billet had been refined and shaped into the rough form of the sword, the smith had to manage the delicate and highly secret process of differential hardening,
which was the key to creating a sword that was both hard enough to cut and soft enough not to break, which required applying the final, lethal heat treatment only to the cutting edge while keeping the spine of the blade relatively softer and more flexible.
To achieve this incredible balance, the blacksmith would first heat the entire blade uniformly to a critical temperature, a bright, even red that was difficult to judge in the dim light of the forge, and then, with agonizing speed, plunge it into the quenching bath,
which was usually a tub of oil, brine, or water that had been specially prepared and was often treated as a mystical substance, a sudden, violent thermal shock that locked the steel's crystal structure into its ultimate hardened state.
This quenching process was the most dangerous moment of the entire sword-making operation, as the sudden contraction of the metal created immense internal stress, and if the temperature was wrong, or the plunge uneven, the sword would often shatter into pieces with a loud, sickening ping sound,
destroying weeks of irreplaceable labor and confirming that the metal had rebelled against the blacksmith's will, a failure that carried severe financial consequences. If the blade survived the quench, it was then incredibly hard but also intensely brittle, meaning that if dropped, it would break like glass, requiring the final, crucial step of tempering, where the blacksmith would reheat the blade very gently to a specific, lower temperature, watching for the faint,
shimmering change in color from straw yellow to purple to blue on the polished surface, which relieved the internal stresses and restored the necessary toughness and flexibility to the lethal edge.
This part of the process demanded a quiet, nerve-wracking patience, as over-tempering the blade by even a few degrees would soften the edge, and under-tempering would leave it fragile, forcing the blacksmith to rely entirely on his eyes and experience.
Staring intently at the dulling metal as if trying to read the future in its changing hue, a delicate operation performed in the overwhelming atmosphere of heat and darkness.
The sheer volume of heavy, continuous hammering required for an object as large as a longsword meant that a blacksmith could not work on it alone. requiring the presence of an assistant or striker who stood opposite the master, wielding the massive chest-high sledgehammer, hitting only where the master's smaller
signaling hammer tapped the hot steel, forcing the two men into a symbiotic rhythm that required perfect timing and mutual, absolute trust to avoid grievous injury. Think of the fatigue that accumulated in the striker's arms and back, swinging that powerful sledge for hours on end, his entire body acting as a human power press, performing the heavy compression that welded the steel layers and drew the massive blade out from the billet. A purely physical existence where the strength of the muscles was the only currency, and exhaustion was a constant, debilitating state. The finished sword, often polished by a grinder or an apprentice using sandstone, became the ultimate symbol of the blacksmith's power, an object that could change the course of a battle or execute a king. And because of this proximity to life and death, medieval society often imbued the blade and its maker with a sense of the supernatural, whispering that the smith had traded something unseen for the ability to master the steel. Legend tells of swords that sang in battle, blades that never dulled, and these stories, even if exaggerated, reflected the very real mystery of the craft, the seemingly impossible transformation of swamp rock into a razor edge that could cleave through armor and bone, making the master blacksmith a figure of immense respect, often granted special privileges or land by the feudal lord who depended entirely on his services. Yet, despite all the mystique and power, the blacksmith's daily reality remained one of constant, grinding physical pain, standing for 10 to 12 hours a day on the hard, unyielding floor, battling the intense heat, the blinding sparks, the ear-shattering noise, and the ever-present threat of a critical, career-ending burn or a life-altering muscular injury that would shatter the fragile, symbiotic rhythm of the forge. When the work was done and the magnificent sword lay cooled and finished on his workbench, the blacksmith had no time to admire the art. There were always hinges to make, chains to mend, plowshares to sharpen, and the constant practical demands of a PI industrial economy meant that the master of the sword often spent far more of his life making nails, which were vital and expensive commodities, than forging weapons of war. We recognize that the creation of the sword was a peak moment of the blacksmith's art, a burst of high-stakes creativity that momentarily elevated him beyond the grime of his daily toil. But the essential, relentless brutality lay in the sheer and monotonous volume of small, repetitive, necessary tasks that kept the village turning, a quiet, unsung labor that demanded just as much physical stamina. As the echoes of the heavy striking hammer slowly fade, and we let the image of the beautifully patterned, deadly sword rest gently in the memory, we prepare to leave the immediate, smoky confines of the forge and step out into the wider world to examine the blacksmith's position within medieval society, exploring the economic pressures, the social standing, and the guilds that governed and complicated his brutal existence. Having explored the intense, almost spiritual, relationship between the blacksmith and the fierce heat of the iron, We must now pull back our focus to understand the paradoxical place this figure occupied within the intricate, highly structured mechanism of medieval society, where his essential services granted him great respect, yet his economic existence often tied him down in chains as heavy and unyielding as the iron he worked.
The blacksmith's social standing was uniquely bifurcated. On one hand, he was immediately recognized as one of the most vital figures in the entire village, a master of a trade that directly involved the four classical elements earth, water, air,
and fire, and therefore held a status far above that of a simple farmer or peasant, often being granted his own small plot of land or exemption from certain local taxes by the grateful lord.
This high esteem was rooted in the sheer necessity of his product, for without the constant rhythmic clanging of the hammer, there could be no tools for agriculture, no axes to clear the wilderness, no chains to secure livestock, and most critically, no horseshoes to allow transport, meaning the entire physical infrastructure and economic viability of the feudal manor depended entirely on his sweaty, blackened hands. However, despite this inherent importance, the blacksmith was still often bound by the oppressive economic realities of the feudal system, which meant that he was rarely working for a free market, but rather owed a significant portion of his labor, time,
and finished products such as new plowshares or the repair of the lord's hunting weapons directly to the local manor or feudal lord as part of his covey or rent obligation, severely limiting his ability to profit from the arduous work.
This system effectively placed a ceiling on his potential wealth, forcing him to spend his most productive hours addressing the lord's constant demands, before he could even begin to forge the small, profitable commissions from the local farmers and tradesmen, creating a perpetual cycle where his skill was celebrated, but his financial independence was meticulously restrained by the ruling class. Furthermore, as towns and cities began to swell in size during the later medieval period, the independent village smith often found himself having to comply with the rigid, powerful control of the craft guilds, which were organized brotherhoods of master smiths that dictated everything from the price of a horseshoe and the quality of the raw materials to the exact number of years an apprentice had to serve before being deemed worthy to open his own forge.
These guilds, while providing some benefit in the form of quality control and mutual support, primarily functioned to restrict competition and enforce conformity, meaning that the blacksmith's creative freedom and his ability to innovate were often stifled by ancient rules and regulations,
all adding to the suffocating sense that his entire life and livelihood were controlled not by the strength of his own arm, but by a complex, often arbitrary, social structure. The apprentice, whose brutal life we briefly touched upon, was the cornerstone of this regulated system, serving a deeply entrenched, multi-year contract that often lasted 7 years or more, during which time he received only the barest necessities: room, board, and the opportunity to learn while performing the most menial,
physically punishing tasks such as constantly pumping the bellows, hauling heavy sacks of charcoal, and sweeping up the dangerous, hot scale from the floor. The master, in turn, was required to house and feed the apprentice, but also had the absolute right to demand obedience and labor, often resorting to harsh physical discipline to enforce efficiency and diligence,
creating a paternalistic but undeniably harsh system where the young boy's survival and future depended entirely on his ability to endure the heat, the deafening noise, and the master's sometimes volatile temper. This deep reliance on the apprentice also highlights another great brutality of the blacksmith's life: the immense cost of fuel and raw materials, which was so prohibitively expensive that they represented a constant, gnawing economic anxiety that rarely left the master's mind, making every failed weld, every wasted lump of coal, or every cracked piece of steel a financial threat to his family's survival. Charcoal, the lifeblood of the forge, had to be purchased or traded from the lonely charcoal burner in vast quantities, and the iron ore itself, which had been painfully processed in the bloomery, represented a massive upfront investment that had to be carefully guarded, forcing the blacksmith to calculate every hammer stroke and every heating cycle to extract the maximum value from his precious, costly stock. The forge itself was a permanent fixture and the central investment of the blacksmith's wealth, often built of heavy stone or timber and carefully situated near a clean water source for the quenching trough, symbolizing not only the man's trade, but also his immovability and rigidness within the community,
confirming that he was tied forever to that one hot, smoky, noisy plot of earth where he had invested all his past and future. Despite the heavy physical toll, the blacksmith's knowledge became a source of intellectual power, as he was often one of the few truly literate men in the village, required to keep detailed accounts of the complex transactions recording the different costs of the various grades of iron.
The length of service for his apprentices, and the exact quantity of nails supplied to the manor forcing a level of numeracy and record-keeping not required of the average medieval peasant.
He was also, by necessity, a practical chemist and physicist, intuitively understanding the crystalline structure of iron, the specific thermal properties of various quenching liquids, and the precise carbon content required for different tools, knowledge he guarded jealously and passed down orally, recognizing that this esoteric wisdom was the only thing truly distinguishing him from the common laborers who merely hauled the ore and pumped the bellows.
The constant repetition of heavy labor throughout the years resulted in the inevitable wear and tear on the master's body, forcing him to train his apprentice not only as a potential successor, but also as an absolute necessity for daily survival.
Relying on the younger man's fresh strength to manage the heaviest work, the striking hammer, the large bellows, the hauling of coal as the master's own joints grew stiff, his hearing faded, and his back perpetually ached.
The true moment of quiet triumph for the medieval blacksmith, however, lay not in the high drama of forging a sword for a knight, but in the intimate, quiet satisfaction of being able to repair the essential things to take a broken axle or a snapped sickle and,
through the sheer application of heat and skill, to make it whole again, restoring functionality to the vital tools that fed and sustained the village. This ability to mend, to fix, and to restore confirmed his role as the great stabilizer of the local economy, the man who stood ready to reverse the small accidents and breakages of daily life, offering a crucial insurance policy against the sudden economic ruin that a broken plow or a lame horse could inflict upon a family living close to the edge of survival.
As we slowly allow the complexity of this social and economic framework to settle in our minds, we understand that the brutality of the blacksmith's life extended far beyond the physical demands of the heat and the hammer, encompassing the economic pressure, the social obligations, and the constant fear of material waste, all conspiring to make his essential status a relentless, lifelong burden. We close this segment by contemplating the sheer, unyielding endurance required for such a life, one where the reward for mastery was not ease or comfort, but merely the capacity to continue the punishing, necessary work for another 30 years, until his worn-out body could no longer withstand the tremendous heat and shock of the forge. The shadows deepen around the figure of the master smith, and as the subtle sounds of the distant village fade, we prepare to move our attention to the specific tools of peace, the incredible detail and engineering that went into the hinges, the locks,
and the agricultural implements that truly defined the quality of medieval life.
Having explored the dramatic brutality inherent in forging the heavy war implements and wrestling with the great beasts of burden, we now settle our gaze upon the less visible, but infinitely more crucial objects that truly underpin the stability and progression of medieval existence.
Recognizing that the smith's greatest volume of work involved the intricate, relentless production of tools designed for survival, security, and the simple maintenance of the world.
Let us begin with the plowshare, a humble wedge of iron that possessed more power over the fate of the common people than any sword, for this tool, which split the hardened earth and prepared the soil for planting,
was the direct technological link between the blacksmith's forge and the very survival of the entire community, representing the fundamental importance of his contribution to the cycle of life and harvest. Forging the plowshare demanded a unique combination of strength and material science, requiring the blacksmith to take a large heavy billet of iron and hammer it meticulously into a wide, strong, slightly curved blade,
ensuring that the working edge was tempered to a degree of toughness that allowed it to resist the tremendous abrasion of dragging through rocky, unforgiving soil for days and weeks on end without shattering or quickly dulling. The sheer physical effort involved in shaping this large mass of metal was exhausting, demanding sustained, heavy, full-body blows to manipulate the iron while it was still hot, often requiring both the master and his striker to work in synchronized bursts of overwhelming power, their combined strengths dedicated entirely to creating a tool that spent its life buried in the dirt, a quiet monument to human necessity. The constant maintenance of the plowshare was another endless, necessary brutality, as the friction of the soil wore down the iron constantly, meaning that farmers frequently brought their blunted or broken shares back to the forge, compelling the blacksmith to perform the tedious and physically jarring task of reheating the massive piece, welding on new layers of high-carbon steel, and hammering the edge back into its functional, life-giving sharpness.
Moving from the essential field to the secured door, we consider the locks and keys, objects of extreme precision that demanded an entirely different kind of mastery, forcing the blacksmith to transition instantly from the sledgehammer's raw power to the delicate, almost surgical finesse required to manipulate tiny pieces of steel and brass, which was a remarkable testament to his adaptability and skill. The medieval lock was often a warded mechanism, a complex puzzle of internal metal barriers that the key had to navigate perfectly, requiring the blacksmith to meticulously file down the tiny brass levers and pins of the lock body, then craft the complex key by hand,
Testing and adjusting its intricate cuts and curves over and over, all while squinting in the dim, smoky light of the forge where precision was perpetually challenged by poor visibility. This microscopic level of detail put immense strain on the blacksmith's eyes, which were already fatigued and damaged by constantly staring into the white heart of the fire, forcing him to hold the tiny components close to the light of a candle or a small, shielded flame. A quiet agony that contrasted sharply with the noise of the main anvil but exerted a deeper, more insidious physical toll on his vision and nervous control.
The key itself often served as a highly personal piece of functional art, decorated with subtle filigree or an intricate bow, ensuring that it was difficult to copy, placing the blacksmith in the unique position of being the solitary guardian of the community's domestic and economic secrets, the only man capable of creating the barrier between the peasant's meager savings and the darkness of the medieval night.
Furthermore, the blacksmith was the maker of hinges and heavy door furniture, crafting the massive, screwed hinges that supported the weighty oak doors of castles, churches, and manor houses, which required not only brute force to forge the long straps of iron, but also the artistic skill to twist and curl the metal into decorative patterns, displaying the contrast between the utilitarian needs of structure and the aesthetic demands of wealth.
These large pieces of architectural ironwork were often forged while seated, a welcome change from standing, but still demanded prolonged, controlled work, ensuring that the iron did not warp as it cooled, and that the finished pin and barrel of the hinge fit together with flawless, smooth operation,
ensuring that the heavy door could swing silently and reliably for centuries, demanding a precision that speaks to the lasting quality of medieval craftsmanship. Perhaps the most monotonous and physically demanding form of repetition in the forge, however, was the constant production of nails, which, being handmade and therefore highly expensive, were critical components that held ships, roofs, carts, and entire timber structures together,
demanding that the blacksmith spend hours upon hours creating thousands upon thousands of virtually identical, four-sided iron pins.
The making of a nail, despite its simplicity, was a testament to efficiency, requiring the blacksmith to heat the end of a long iron rod, clip of a precise length with a sharp cutting tool called a hardy, quickly hammer the small, glowing piece into a taper, and then press the hot shaft into a heading tool a special hole in the anvil to form the distinctive, broad head with one or two sharp strikes, repeating the process instantly before the main rod cooled.
This relentless, monotonous repetition of small, focused strikes, repeated hundreds of times in a single sitting, caused severe, localized fatigue in the wrist and forearm, contributing to the painful joint swelling and chronic inflammation that plagued the blacksmith, turning the simple creation of a common nail into a prolonged, low-grade torture that chipped away at his health day after exhausting day.
The necessity of producing countless yards of chain, used for everything from securing dock moorings and portcullises to tethering animals, involved another layer of repetitive heat and welding, requiring the blacksmith to shape hundreds of identical iron loops, reheat the ends until they were nearly molten, interlink them, and then quickly weld the tiny junction closed with focused blows, ensuring that every single link possessed the strength to hold immense loads.
We realize that the true, unsung genius of the medieval blacksmith lay in his ability to maintain this dual mastery: the powerful, noisy, large-scale work of the plowshare and the sword, which required explosive force and endurance, seamlessly paired with the quiet, detailed, small-scale work of the lock and the nail,
which required minute precision and unwavering focus, all performed within the same hostile environment of searing heat and pervasive noise.
His life, measured out not in minutes or hours, but in the countless cycles of heat and hammer, was a profound, enduring sacrifice to the practical necessities of a world struggling against wilderness and famine, transforming crude pork ore into the instruments of both power and peace. And in the quiet of this moment, we honor the brutal, unromanticized labor that made the vastness of the medieval world functional and secure.
Allow the gentle image of a beautifully filed key or a heavy, secure hinge to occupy your thoughts, understanding the dedication behind its creation, as we prepare to move towards the darkest aspect of the blacksmith's enduring legacy, his proximity to torture and war. The fire is banking down now, its glow softer, drawing the long day to its inevitable close, leaving only the warmth and the gentle rhythm of your contemplation.
Having explored the foundational importance of the blacksmith's work in maintaining life, commerce, and security through essential tools of peace, we must now confront the darker, morally complex side of his mastery.
Acknowledging that the same hands that craft the life-giving plowshare were also the only hands capable of forging the cold, lethal instruments of war, punishment, and the legal violence necessary to maintain the rigid and often brutal order of the medieval state. The blacksmith was, by necessity and decree, an essential participant in the machinery of conflict, responsible not only for the noble swords we previously examined, but for the huge, monotonous volume of less romanticized weaponry that made up the true backbone of medieval armies, including countless spearheads, arrowheads, bolts for crossbows, and the heavy iron fittings for shields and armor. The creation of these projectile tips, in particular, was a task of intense, mind-numbing repetition, requiring the smith to forge hundreds of small, identical pieces of iron with deadly precision, ensuring that the sockets and tangs fit perfectly onto the wooden shafts and that the edges were sharp enough to pierce thick leather or mail, a job that was less about artistic creation and more about the relentless, industrialized manufacture of death. Beyond the battlefield, the blacksmith held the grim distinction of being the sole source for the instruments of judicial and social control, meaning that whenever the feudal or religious authorities required means of enforcing obedience, extracting confessions, or inflicting public shaming, the commission inevitably fell to the master of the forge, forcing him into a direct, physical partnership with the state's power to inflict pain. This dark inventory included items like the heavy iron collars and manacles used to restrain prisoners, the strong chains necessary to secure the doors and windows of the local dungeon or jail, and the complex iron fittings that were central to the operation of the stocks and the pillory, the public devices used to humiliate and expose common criminals to the fury of the crowd.
Perhaps most disturbing was the forging of instruments specifically designed for torture and severe corporal punishment, where the blacksmith was required to apply his profound knowledge of metallurgy and structure not for creation, but for cruelty, designing iron devices that were built to inflict maximum,
Prolonged suffering while maintaining a gruesome functionality, a silent contract with the darkest aspects of human nature. This work demanded a chilling intimacy with the mechanics of pain, as the smith had to forge pieces that were specifically shaped to clamp onto vulnerable parts of the human body, such as thumb screws, spiked chairs, or the infamous metal mask of the scold's bridle,
which was a deeply humiliating and effective tool for silencing rebellious women, requiring curved metal forms that fitted precisely and painfully over the head and into the mouth.
The blacksmith's role in this system was not always by choice, as he was often compelled by the authority of the local lord, the church, or the king's justice to perform these necessary and terrible commissions.
Understanding that refusal to forge the implements of punishment was a direct act of treason or disobedience that would invite the same brutal justice upon himself and his family.
Even the seemingly innocuous chain and padlock took on a sinister implication in this context, moving beyond the simple security of a barn door to become the tool used to bind slaves, secure heretics, or lock a suspected witch away from the community, demonstrating how the blacksmith's neutral skill was constantly being co-opted and politicized by the powerful forces of the age. Furthermore, the blacksmith was often the maker of gibbets, the tall iron cages or frames used for public display of executed criminals, a massive and heavy piece of construction that required weeks of forging and welding large iron bars, creating a stark,
terrifying symbol of absolute power that served as a grim warning to all who traveled the main roads outside the town walls. The forging of armor also contributed significantly to this dark ledger, as the heavy plate and chainmail, requiring thousands of perfectly formed links and carefully curved pieces of steel, were not just protective garments, but the very symbols of martial dominance and the overwhelming inequality of force that allowed the mounted knight to suppress peasant rebellions and wage devastating wars of conquest. This continuous involvement with war and execution placed the blacksmith in a perpetual state of moral ambiguity within the community. He was respected for his ability to save lives through the plowshare, but he was also regarded with a certain fear, recognized as the man whose hands brought the tools of death and bondage into tangible, lethal existence, a tension that added psychological weight to his physical burdens.
The secrecy surrounding these commissions was immense, as the work for the military or the instruments of torture often had to be done under the cover of night, hidden away in the darkest corner of the forge.
A necessary discretion that contributed to the enduring folk mythology of the smith as a solitary figure who trafficked in dangerous knowledge and was capable of making things that could only be used for harm. This constant work with instruments of violence demanded a detachment and an emotional hardening, forcing the smith to suppress the natural revulsion that might arise from shaping a piece of iron into something designed to mangle human flesh or lock another human being in perpetual misery.
A profound psychological cost that was rarely acknowledged but undeniably paid by every man of the forge. The sheer repetitive effort of the dark commissions, the hundreds of spear tips, the intricate tiny levers of the shackles, the heavy bars of the gibbet all compounded the physical toll, ensuring that the same hammer strikes that built the cathedral also drove the nails into the pillory,
confirming that the brute reality of the blacksmith's labor was indifferent to the moral outcome of his creations.
As we slowly step back from this somber contemplation, allowing the shadows of the dungeon and the execution field to dissipate, we recognize that the medieval blacksmith was much more than a craftsman. He was the unsung, essential enabler of the state's power, the indispensable artist of both creation and destruction, whose life of heat and iron gave physical form to the entire spectrum of medieval existence, from the highest chivalry to the deepest degradation. The silence of the evening deepens now, leaving only the slow, rhythmic sound of your breathing as we prepare to transition from the practical realities of the forge to the rich, often exaggerated world of the blacksmith's legend and mythology.
Exploring how society attempted to cope with and explain the sheer intimidating power of the man who commanded fire. After witnessing the blacksmith's unavoidable connection to the engines of violence and the necessary tools of survival, we can now appreciate why the figure of the man who mastered fire became so deeply embedded in the foundation myths and legends of nearly every civilization, for his ability to transform inert,
cold stone into shimmering, lethal metal seemed to defy the natural laws of the universe, lending his craft an aura of powerful, dangerous magic.
The forge itself was viewed not merely as a workshop, but as a liminal space, a place existing between worlds, where the raw, chaotic energy of the elemental fire was contained and controlled by human hands, allowing the smith to act as a crucial intermediary between the chaotic natural world and the disciplined, ordered world of human technology and war, granting him a status that was both respected and profoundly feared.
In the classical world, this mythical reverence was embodied by Hephaestus, known to the Romans as Vulcan, the lame god of fire and metalworking who was simultaneously an outcast from Olympus and the indispensable creator of all the gods' finest weapons and intricate devices.
A duality that mirrored the real-life blacksmith who was often revered for his skill, yet physically set apart from the community by his soot-blackened skin and constant, deafening noise. This connection to the lame god subtly acknowledged the immense physical price paid by the smith, reflecting the reality that few men could survive the years of heavy hammering and intense heat without suffering chronic joint pain, eye damage, or crippling injuries from the ever-present danger of the shop, suggesting that the legendary disability was a mythological representation of the real-world occupational brutality. Moving into the Norse and Germanic traditions, we encounter the complex, dark figure of Wayland, the smith of Lunda, who was portrayed as a supreme master craftsman capable of forging legendary, unbreakable swords and wings, yet whose story is tragically defined by his capture, forced servitude, and eventual bloody revenge.
which further reinforced the medieval idea that the smith's exceptional skill was often coupled with social isolation and a life lived under duress.
These powerful cultural narratives instilled in the medieval populace a deep, unquestioning belief that the blacksmith possessed sacred secrets that could not be shared with ordinary men, leading to elaborate folk customs and beliefs surrounding the materials and processes of the forge,
where practical metallurgy was indistinguishably mixed with whispered incantations and necessary superstition. One of the most enduring and chilling of these beliefs revolved around the quenching process, where the sudden plunge of the white-hot blade into liquid was seen as the moment the metal received its soul, leading to practices where the smith might quench a war blade in the freshly drawn blood of a strong animal, or even, according to some grim folklore,
in human urine or a concoction of strange herbs, believing these impure liquids imparted a superior toughness and deadly edge to the finished steel. Although modern science confirms that these organic liquids often contain nitrogen and phosphorus that could indeed subtly alter the hardening process, the medieval mind interpreted the resulting superior blade not as chemistry, but as a successful communion with the dark forces,
further alienating the blacksmith and cementing his image as one who tampered with life and death in his fiery cavern. The sound of the anvil itself was often considered mystical, believed to be the voice of the earth itself or the rhythm of creation, and it was thought that the anvil stone or the heavy iron block had to be carefully consecrated,
sometimes having coins or even pieces of gold buried beneath it to ensure the forge remained prosperous and that the hammer's ring retained its deep, resonant purity.
Furthermore, the blacksmith was often viewed as the natural opponent of the malevolent spirits and fairies that haunted the wild edges of the medieval world, as iron was one of the few substances thought to possess the inherent power to ward off such creatures, meaning that every horseshoe nailed to a cottage door and every iron cross forged for a new church was seen as a tangible piece of magical protection provided by the smith's mastery. In the small, vulnerable medieval village, the blacksmith effectively functioned as an unordained magician of utility, providing essential protective wards, crafting the instruments used in folk medicine,
and sometimes even being called upon to read omens in the fire's unpredictable flame, or to offer crude blessings upon farming tools before they went into the earth. This pervasive belief system meant that the blacksmith could never truly escape the demands of his forge, as his skills were required not just for the practical necessities of hinges and plowshares, but also for the psychological safety of the community, relying on him to literally hammer out the protection and security that shielded them from the perceived spiritual dangers lurking in the darkness beyond the village firelight.
The physical reality of this mythological status meant that the smith was constantly dealing with contradictory forces, revered for his power yet sometimes ostracized due to the noise and smoke, feared for his secrets yet relied upon absolutely.
A man whose hands were both physically scarred by the hammer and metaphorically imbued with the ability to bend the very will of the metal.
As the final, lingering images of the ancient gods and mythical heroes slowly dissolve back into the comforting, rhythmic sounds of the forge, we recognize that the medieval blacksmith's true genius lay in his ability to embody both the myth and the man, using the cloak of magic to obscure the difficult, repetitive, and deeply unromantic labor that truly gave him his power over the cold iron. We gently leave the realm of whispering folklore, ready to return to the cold, hard, and undeniable truth of the physical tools that defined his every working hour, examining the sheer variety of hand tools that were required to manage the 1,000 different tasks demanded of the village smith.
Having moved through the grand narratives of war, peace, and ancient mythology, we now ground ourselves once more in the sensory core of the blacksmith's labor, focusing intently on the immediate instruments of his trade, the heavy, blackened, custom-forged hand tools that represented his only defense against the searing heat and the unyielding stubbornness of the iron, each tool a testament to his skill and a conductor of the constant physical shock that defined his working life.
The hammer, the most fundamental of all tools, was not a single entity, but a diverse family of weighted heads, ranging from the massive, two-handed sledge used by the striker for welding and drawing out large billets, which demanded explosive, rhythmic power, down to the small,
specialized cross-peen or ball-peen hammers used by the master for delicate shaping and spreading of metal, each requiring a specific and different kind of strain on the wrist and elbow.
The sheer variety of these hammers, many of which were forged and meticulously heat-treated by the master himself to his own exacting specifications, meant that the blacksmith's hands possessed an innate, kinetic memory of dozens of different weights and balances,
allowing him to instinctively select the perfect striking surface, the flat face for consolidation, the rounded ball peen for texture, or the wedge-like cross peen for stretching the iron across a precise line.
While the hammer was the instrument of active force and creation, the tongs served as the indispensable, fireproof extension of the smith's own arm, allowing him to hold, manipulate, and safely guide the glowing, white-hot iron, which would instantly burn through flesh and bone, demanding a constant, vice-like grip that engaged the muscles of the forearm in a perpetual, agonizing state of static tension throughout the long working day.
The medieval smith needed an array of tongs, each specifically forged to hold a different shape: the flat jaw for square or rectangular stock, the hollow bit for circular rods, and the specialized bowl tongs for gripping the round head of a fastener, requiring him to constantly switch tools.
Each exchange a moment of critical timing where dropping the hot work could ruin hours of effort, pose an immediate danger to his feet and legs. The relentless need to keep the grips of the tongs closed tight, fighting against the expanding heat of the work and the natural tendency of the heavy metal to slip, meant that the blacksmith's forearms and the muscles around his thumb were often chronically strained and knotted,
a different kind of debilitating pain that contrasted with the impact shock absorbed by the shoulder and elbow from the constant hammering.
Another critical category of tools were the chisels and hardies, the cutting instruments of the forge that allowed the smith to divide, notch, or trim hot iron,
which presented a unique metallurgical challenge, because the cutting edge of the chisel itself had to be forged and tempered to a hardness superior to that of the workpiece, a delicate balance between achieving maximum hardness without becoming so brittle that it would shatter into dangerous, flying shrapnel.
The hardie, a specialized chisel with a square shank designed to fit directly into the hardy hole of the anvil, allowed the smith to lay his hot iron across the upward-facing blade and strike it with a hammer, effectively using the anvil itself as a sturdy cutting block.
An ingenious technique that required precise alignment of the blow and a simultaneous steady hand to prevent the work from skidding violently off the razor-sharp edge. Moving into the realm of shaping and finishing, the blacksmith relied upon punches and drifts to create holes, and swages and fullers to manipulate the texture of the metal, forcing him to apply tremendous directed force to small, specific points on the iron to create everything from the tiny eye of a needle to the decorative grooves on a hinge, which again required a deep understanding of metal flow.
The process of punching a hole, for example, was a careful feat of heat control and physics, where the blacksmith would drive the punch through the hot metal just short of full penetration, quickly flip the workpiece over, and then drive the punch through the bottom layer,
creating a clean hole and popping out the small, often red-hot puck of waste metal, a precise operation that prevented the metal from tearing or stressing.
The tools themselves, constantly subjected to the immense thermal shock of being near or touching white-hot metal, required continuous repair and maintenance, forcing the blacksmith to spend his precious downtime the hours between the end of the workday and the next morning laboring over his own instruments, regrinding a chipped hammer face,
redressing a blunt chisel, or rewelding the cracked jaws of a frequently used pair of tongs.
This unyielding necessity of tool maintenance added hours of unsung, focused labor to his week, emphasizing that the blacksmith's job was a self-perpetuating cycle of creating and repairing the very means of his own survival, a true testament to the self-reliance that defined the core of the medieval smith's brutal existence, where mastery of iron included mastery over the instruments of that mastery. As we visualize the array of hammers, the gripping curves of the tongs, and the sharp edges of the chisels, we gain a deeper appreciation for the relentless, tactile brutality of the blacksmith's hands, which were hardened and scarred not just by the weight of the blows,
but by the constant, intimate contact with the multitude of specialized, heat-absorbing instruments that facilitated his incredible power over the material world.
Allow the quiet image of those strong, permanently blackened hands holding the familiar wooden handle of a hammer to guide you deeper into calm, contemplating the silent, heavy dialogue between the man and his tools, a necessary conversation conducted entirely through the rhythmic language of shock and heat.
After detailing the physical trauma inflicted by the hammer and the psychological weight of the smith's terrible creations, we must now delve into the unseen brutalities of his life, examining the constant, non-negotiable demands of air and fuel, which were the very breath and blood of the forge,
and whose acquisition and consumption inflicted a chronic environmental and respiratory toll that slowly consumed the blacksmith's health from the inside out.
The bellows, the simple mechanism of leather and wood, represented the absolute dependency of the forge on the element of air, which had to be relentlessly pumped into the fire to sustain the high temperatures necessary for transforming iron, forcing the apprentice or the master himself to spend hours on end performing the exhausting, rhythmic labor of raising and depressing the massive wooden arms, which was a relentless, monotonous form of aerobic exercise.
This constant pumping action, often carried out by a young apprentice for 7 or more years, demanded an extreme endurance of the lower back, shoulders, and arms, forcing the lungs to work at maximum capacity within the thick, smoky atmosphere of the shop, turning the act of breathing itself into a physically challenging and fundamentally damaging component of the trade. A cruel irony for the man who mastered fire. The fuel for the forge, primarily charcoal, was not just a cost in coin but an immense environmental footprint, as the medieval period's insatiable demand for iron necessitated the clearing of vast swaths of forests to feed the continuous need for high-quality, pure carbon fuel, placing the blacksmith at the center of a large-scale, often destructive, ecological cycle that transformed the landscape around his community. The constant burning of this massive quantity of charcoal within the poorly ventilated forge created an atmosphere heavy with carbon monoxide and fine carbon particulates, a perpetual, invisible poison that the blacksmith inhaled with every breath, leading to chronic symptoms like persistent headaches, dizziness, and a slow, insidious degradation of his pulmonary system that he simply accepted as the expected cost of his fiery profession.
The fine, dark soot and ash did not just coat the blacksmith's skin and clothing, giving him his characteristic appearance, but permanently stained his internal organs, scarring the lung tissue over years of exposure, often leading to a hacking, deep-chested smith's cough that marked him in his later years, a relentless condition that sapped his energy and shortened his natural lifespan far below that of his agricultural neighbors.
Compounding this respiratory hazard was the intense heat of the forge, which not only forced the blacksmith to inhale the dangerous air, but also caused him to breathe rapidly and shallowly in an attempt to dissipate the immense thermal load on his body,
thereby drawing even more of the toxic fumes and fine metal dust deep into the fragile, unprotected recesses of his lungs.
The very noise of the anvil, which we have discussed as a source of deafness, also contributed to this physical strain, as the constant high-decibel shock forced the body into a perpetual state of stress, tensing the muscles, raising the heart rate, and demanding energy just to cope with the sonic environment, which further depleted the smith's physical reserves already taxed by the heavy lifting and relentless heat. Furthermore, the need to maintain the fire, which rarely went out completely, meant the blacksmith was constantly exposed to the unique hazards of sulfur and iron oxides, the heavy,
metallic smells that clung to the inside of the forge, which were released when impure charcoal or the raw iron itself oxidized in the high heat, creating fumes that irritated the eyes, throat, and nose, making every day a confrontation with chemical irritants.
The crucial supply of water, necessary not only for drinking and fighting dehydration, but also for the quenching trough, was a constant logistical burden, requiring the frequent hauling of heavy buckets from a nearby well or stream back into the forge, where the water quickly became foul, warm, and contaminated with metal filings and scale, creating a stagnant environment that, while necessary for the metal, contributed to the general unhealthy atmosphere of the shop. The brutal reality of the blacksmith's exhaustion was not simply a matter of muscle fatigue, but a systemic depletion caused by the cumulative assault of heat, noise, toxic fumes, and the massive caloric expenditure required to move heavy iron, pump the air, and swing the hammer, ensuring that his body was constantly fighting against 4 or 5 concurrent environmental stressors that provided no opportunity for genuine physical recovery. As we conclude this examination of the air and the fire, we recognize that the blacksmith's trade was a profound sacrifice of his internal health for the sake of external utility, trading his clean breath and clear hearing for the power to transform the inert earth into the very structures of civilization. a silent internal brutality that was perhaps the most enduring and tragic consequence of his life lived in the heat. Having explored the external brutalities of the forge, from the scorching heat and the crushing noise to the pervasive smoke and the exhausting labor of the bellows, we must now turn our attention to the final, most relentless consequence of the blacksmith's life, the slow, inevitable, and total wearing out of the body, a physical degradation that transformed the strong, vital craftsman into a figure perpetually hunched and afflicted by chronic, unyielding pain long before his natural end. The constant, repetitive impact shock delivered by the hammer, which vibrated thousands of times a day through the skeletal structure, resulted in a catalogue of musculoskeletal disasters that were simply accepted as the badges of his trade, including severely eroded cartilage, swollen and stiffened joints, and chronic arthritis that fused the bones of the elbow, shoulder, and spine into painful, unmovable structures. The blacksmith's hands and wrists, which were the most critical and overused tools in his arsenal, suffered from permanent damage, with the tendons often becoming inflamed and thickened from the static, vice-like grip required to hold the tongs, and the fingers frequently locking into a permanent curve, a condition known to modern doctors as Dupuytren's contracture, making the simple act of opening a palm or extending a finger a daily, agonizing impossibility.
His lower back and knees, perpetually stressed by the long hours of standing on the hard earthen floor and the frequent, heavy bending required to pick up iron, hoist charcoal, and trim horses' hooves, eventually succumbed to irreversible damage, with compressed spinal discs and ground-down knee joints, ensuring that the old blacksmith walked with a shuffling, laboured gait, every step a dull reminder of decades spent in service to the anvil.
The frequent burns and lacerations, which were a daily, unavoidable reality of working in close proximity to molten metal and razor-sharp tools, often led to chronic infections and deep scar tissue that stiffened the skin. And in the absence of modern antibiotics, even a seemingly minor wound could turn into a life-threatening ailment, demanding time away from the forge that the economically stressed smith simply could not afford to take. We must also remember the unseen injuries, the internal hemorrhaging caused by the strain of lifting massive pieces of iron, and the frequent risk of developing crippling hernias from the sudden, immense strain of a massive, synchronized hammer blow. Ailments that progressed silently and often required the smith to continue working through pain that would send a modern laborer immediately to the emergency room.
Due to this relentless physical and environmental assault, the medieval blacksmith often faced a diminished life expectancy compared to wealthier, less physically exposed members of society, with chronic respiratory illness, systemic joint damage, and the constant threat of infection conspiring to shorten his years.
Meaning that the reward for his mastery was not a long, peaceful retirement, but a difficult, painful final decade of compromised functionality. The concept of retirement itself was almost non-existent for the vast majority of medieval craftsmen, meaning the blacksmith often had to continue his punishing work until his body simply failed, relying on the diminishing returns of his crippled body and the increasing strength of his now mastered apprentice to keep the forge fire burning and food on the table, creating a desperate, slow decline in productivity and income. As the master aged and his strength waned, he was forced to delegate more and more of the heavy, high-impact work, the main hammering, the bloom consolidation, to his apprentice or striker, relegating himself to the tasks that required more patience than power, such as the meticulous filing of lock mechanisms, the delicate tempering of blades, or the constant, grinding work of sharpening and finishing tools.
This final transition was often accompanied by a profound psychological toll, as the master craftsman, whose identity was inextricably linked to the strength of his hammer arm and the perfect rhythm of his strike, had to slowly cede physical control of his own forge.
Watching his apprentice take on the central role at the anvil, marking the undeniable, visible end of his own physical dominance and independence. The legacy of the blacksmith, therefore, was not merely the tools he left behind, but the transferred pain and knowledge he passed on to the next generation, where the apprentice, now the master, inherited not only the skills of the forge, but also the deep-seated awareness that his own body was now entering the long, brutal countdown toward the same inevitable, physical ruin. The brutality of the medieval blacksmith's life ultimately rests in this cruel paradox. He was a man who worked tirelessly to maintain the functionality of his entire community, ensuring that all their necessary tools were sharp, strong, and whole. Yet in the process, He was forced to slowly and systematically break his own body beyond repair, forging his own quiet, painful fate in the heat of his beloved fire. Having chronicled the smith's profound physical cost and his inescapable role in the profane violence of the feudal world, we now turn to his equally vital, yet often contradictory, relationship with the medieval church, recognizing that the man who mastered fire was indispensable to the sacred sphere, responsible for forging the very symbols of Christian devotion and the crucial physical architecture of spiritual authority. The blacksmith was the sole craftsman capable of creating the enduring heavy iron crosses that crowned the spires of cathedrals, marked grave sites in cemeteries, and offered a solemn, visible focal point for village devotion,
requiring him to shift his focus from the brutal necessity of the plowshare to the meticulous, symbolic perfection demanded by the central icon of the faith.
Forging a large processional or altar cross was a complex task that demanded not only immense physical strength to work the heavy iron members, but also a keen sense of theological design, ensuring that the iron was shaped into the exact, prescribed proportions of the crucifix, often incorporating delicate decorative elements like stylized fleur-de-lis or trefoils at the terminals of the arms.
This religious commission meant the blacksmith had to carefully manage the contrast between the rough, earthy quality of the raw iron and the spiritual purity of the finished object, requiring hours of meticulous filing, grinding, and polishing to transform the sooty metal into a clean, unblemished surface worthy of representing the sacrifice and ultimate authority of the divine.
Perhaps the most massive and technologically demanding commission the medieval blacksmith undertook for the church was the creation of the great bell, which, while often cast from bronze by specialized founders, depended entirely on the smith for its colossal iron fittings, the heavy yoke, the clapper, the mounting hardware, and the complex mechanism necessary to allow the massive weight to swing rhythmically. The bell clapper itself was a testament to the smith's strength and skill, a massive, teardrop-shaped piece of wrought iron that had to be forged and tempered to withstand the thousands of high-impact blows it would deliver against the bell's inner wall over decades of use, requiring the blacksmith to shape a huge mass of steel with the absolute assurance that it would neither snap upon striking nor damage the delicate bronze of the bell. The rhythmic, deep tolling of the finished bell, which called the faithful to prayer, announced births and deaths, and warned the community of approaching danger, was entirely dependent on the structural integrity of the iron components forged in the intense heat of the blacksmith shop,
confirming that the very sound of Christian civilization was anchored in the master of the forge's heavy labor.
Furthermore, the blacksmith was tasked with creating the heavy, ornate iron grills, hinges, and protective cagework that enclosed sacred relics, guarded the treasury, or secured the massive oak doors of the cathedral against thieves and attackers, which often required him to spend weeks forging complex, interlacing patterns of iron bars, each joint meticulously hammered and forge welded to create an impenetrable yet beautiful barrier. These commissions for architectural security, particularly the construction of elaborate candelabra and lecterns, often allowed the blacksmith to demonstrate his artistic mastery, requiring him to use specialized techniques like repousse and chasing to decorative texture and fine detail to the iron surface, transforming a simple load-bearing bar into a spiraling, vegetative motif that decorated the sacred interior. The church, recognizing the unique, almost magical power the smith wielded over the element of fire, often granted the blacksmith a measure of spiritual authority within his trade, sometimes blessing the forge itself with rituals,
viewing the heat and the smoke as a metaphor for the purifying fire of purgatory or the transformative power of the divine spirit.
In a curious parallel to the myths of Wayland and Vulcan, the church sometimes used the figure of the smith to illustrate moral lessons, portraying the relentless hammering and the intense heat as a necessary purification process, drawing a direct analogy between the violent cleansing of impurities from the raw iron and the spiritual cleansing of sin from the human soul. The blacksmith was often the maker of the specific iron tools required by the church itself, including the heavy iron book clasps that secured ancient manuscripts, the specialized chisels used by masons to shape the stone of the sanctuary, and the heavy chains used to secure valuable books to the reading desk, ensuring that the technology of the sacred realm was entirely reliant on the smoky atmosphere of the forge. The necessity of working for the church added another layer of pressure and obligation to the smith's already crushing workload, as these sacred commissions, often tied to important feast days or the visit of a bishop, had to be completed perfectly and on time,
requiring the blacksmith to pull all-night shifts by the flickering firelight, battling his chronic exhaustion to ensure the spiritual needs of the community were met.
Thus, the medieval blacksmith stood as a true paradox, a figure often grimy, rough, and subject to the lowliest physical labor, yet simultaneously an indispensable artist and enabler of the highest forms of religious devotion and architectural grandeur, demonstrating that the brutal,
honest truth of the iron was considered worthy of standing alongside the most sublime expressions of faith. Having discussed the smith's physical strength and his role in the social fabric, we now turn to the most acute and purely intellectual brutality of his craft, which lay not in the pounding of the hammer, but in the final, life or death decision made in the quiet heat of the forge, precise moment of heat treating, where the finished iron either transformed into enduring, functional steel or instantly shattered into worthless scrap due to a single, tiny misjudgment of temperature.
This critical metallurgical step involved two distinct, but inseparable acts, hardening and tempering, processes that required the blacksmith to abandon brute force entirely and rely instead on a profound, internalized knowledge of thermal physics, forcing him to gauge molecular changes happening within the heart of the steel based only on the subtle, shifting colors revealed by the intense, glowing heat. The first step, hardening, demanded that the blacksmith heat the finished piece of sword, an axe, or a file to its critical temperature, the precise point where the carbon molecules fully dissolve into the iron crystal structure, creating a uniform solution, which was an invisible threshold that could only be judged visually by the shade of the metal, typically a bright, even cherry red or dull orange, in the perpetually dim light of the workshop. This was a task of immense pressure because if the metal were pulled out too early, it would not harden properly, remaining soft and useless. If it were left in for just a moment too long, the grain would coarsen, making the resulting steel intensely brittle and prone to catastrophic failure, requiring the smith to peer intently into the fire, trying to read the perfect moment in the shimmering glow of the iron.
Once the critical temperature was achieved, the blacksmith had mere seconds to perform the quench, plunging the white-hot object entirely and instantly into the chilling liquid, a sudden, violent thermal shock that arrested the molecular change, locking the carbon atoms into a new, incredibly hard,
strained crystalline structure known as martensite, which was the source of the steel's cutting power.
The quenching medium itself varied, sometimes being clear water, sometimes oil or brine for a less aggressive cooling rate, and occasionally strange secretive mixtures including stale urine,
which surprisingly provided consistent cooling and contained trace elements that slightly improved the steel, each choice reflecting a calculated risk against the immense stresses that threatened to warp the metal into a curved, unusable shape or snap it entirely with a terrible, high-pitched ping. If the blade survived this initial violent transformation, it emerged from the liquid incredibly hard, but also deeply brittle, existing in a state of extreme internal tension where a simple fall or a sharp knock could reduce weeks of painstaking work to fragments, forcing the blacksmith immediately into the second, calmer, yet equally nerve-wracking stage, tempering.
After detailing the physical trauma inflicted by the hammer and the psychological weight of the smith's terrible creations, we must now delve into the unseen brutalities of his life, examining the constant, non-negotiable demands of air and fuel, which were the very breath and blood of the forge,
and whose acquisition and consumption inflicted a chronic environmental and respiratory toll that slowly consumed the blacksmith's health from the inside out.
The bellows, the simple mechanism of leather and wood, represented the absolute dependency of the forge on the element of air, which had to be relentlessly pumped into the fire to sustain the high temperatures necessary for transforming iron, forcing the apprentice or the master himself to spend hours on end performing the exhausting, rhythmic labor of raising and depressing the massive wooden arms, which was a relentless, monotonous form of aerobic exercise.
This constant pumping action, often carried out by a young apprentice for 7 or more years, demanded an extreme endurance of the lower back, shoulders, and arms, forcing the lungs to work at maximum capacity within the thick, smoky atmosphere of the shop, turning the act of breathing itself into a physically challenging and fundamentally damaging component of the trade, a cruel irony for the man who mastered fire. The fuel for the forge, primarily charcoal, was not just a cost in coin but an immense environmental footprint, as the medieval period's insatiable demand for iron necessitated the clearing of vast swaths of forests to feed the continuous need for high-quality, pure carbon fuel, placing the blacksmith at the center of a large-scale, often destructive, ecological cycle that transformed the landscape around his community. The constant burning of this massive quantity of charcoal within the poorly ventilated forge created an atmosphere heavy with carbon monoxide and fine carbon particulates, a perpetual, invisible poison that the blacksmith inhaled with every breath, leading to chronic symptoms like persistent headaches, dizziness, and a slow, insidious degradation of his pulmonary system that he simply accepted as the expected cost of his fiery profession.
The fine, dark soot and ash did not just coat the blacksmith's skin and clothing, giving him his characteristic appearance, but permanently stained his internal organs, scarring the lung tissue over years of exposure, often leading to a hacking, deep-chested smith's cough that marked him in his later years, a relentless condition that sapped his energy and shortened his natural lifespan far below that of his agricultural neighbors.
Compounding this respiratory hazard was the intense heat of the forge, which not only forced the blacksmith to inhale the dangerous air, but also caused him to breathe rapidly and shallowly in an attempt to dissipate the immense thermal load on his body,
thereby drawing even more of the toxic fumes and fine metal dust deep into the fragile, unprotected recesses of his lungs.
The very noise of the anvil, which we have discussed as a source of deafness, also contributed to this physical strain, as the constant high-decibel shock forced the body into a perpetual state of stress, tensing the muscles, raising the heart rate, and demanding energy just to cope with the sonic environment, which further depleted the smith's physical reserves already taxed by the heavy lifting and relentless heat. Furthermore, the need to maintain the fire, which rarely went out completely, meant the blacksmith was constantly exposed to the unique hazards of sulfur and iron oxides, the heavy,
metallic smells that clung to the inside of the forge, which were released when impure charcoal or the raw iron itself oxidized in the high heat, creating fumes that irritated the eyes, throat, and nose, making every day a confrontation with chemical irritants.
The crucial supply of water, necessary not only for drinking and fighting dehydration, but also for the quenching trough, was a constant logistical burden, requiring the frequent hauling of heavy buckets from a nearby well or stream back into the forge, where the water quickly became foul, warm, and contaminated with metal filings and scale, creating a stagnant environment that, while necessary for the metal, contributed to the general unhealthy atmosphere of the shop. The brutal reality of the blacksmith's exhaustion was not simply a matter of muscle fatigue, but a systemic depletion caused by the cumulative assault of heat, noise, toxic fumes, and the massive caloric expenditure required to move heavy iron, pump the air, and swing the hammer, ensuring that his body was constantly fighting against 4 or 5 concurrent environmental stresses that provided no opportunity for genuine physical recovery. As we conclude this examination of the air and the fire, we recognize that the blacksmith's trade was a profound sacrifice of his internal health for the sake of external utility, trading his clean breath and clear hearing for the power to transform the inert earth into the very structures of civilization. A silent internal brutality that was perhaps the most enduring and tragic consequence of his life lived in the heat. Having explored the external brutalities of the forge, from the scorching heat and the crushing noise to the pervasive smoke, and the exhausting labor of the bellows, we must now turn our attention to the final, most relentless consequence of the blacksmith's life, the slow, inevitable, and total wearing out of the body, a physical degradation that transformed the strong, vital craftsman into a figure perpetually hunched and afflicted by chronic, unyielding pain long before his natural end. The constant, repetitive impact shock delivered by the hammer, which vibrated thousands of times a day through the skeletal structure, resulted in a catalogue of musculoskeletal disasters that were simply accepted as the badges of his trade, including severely eroded cartilage, swollen and stiffened joints, and chronic arthritis that fused the bones of the elbow, shoulder, and spine into painful, unmovable structures. The blacksmith's hands and wrists, which were the most critical and overused tools in his arsenal, suffered from permanent damage, with the tendons often becoming inflamed and thickened from the static, vice-like grip required to hold the tongs, and the fingers frequently locking into a permanent curve, a condition known to modern doctors as Dupuytren's contracture, making the simple act of opening a palm or extending a finger a daily, agonizing impossibility.
His lower back and knees, perpetually stressed by the long hours of standing on the hard earthen floor and the frequent, heavy bending required to pick up iron, hoist charcoal, and trim horses' hooves, eventually succumbed to irreversible damage, with compressed spinal discs and ground-down knee joints, ensuring that the old blacksmith walked with a shuffling, labored gait, every step a dull reminder of decades spent in service to the anvil.
The frequent burns and lacerations, which were a daily, unavoidable reality of working in close proximity to molten metal and razor-sharp tools, often led to chronic infections and deep scar tissue that stiffened the skin. And in the absence of modern antibiotics, even a seemingly minor wound could turn into a life-threatening ailment, demanding time away from the forge that the economically stressed smith simply could not afford to take. We must also remember the unseen injuries, the internal hemorrhaging caused by the strain of lifting massive pieces of iron, and the frequent risk of developing crippling hernias from the sudden, immense strain of a massive, synchronized hammer blow. Ailments that progressed silently and often required the smith to continue working through pain that would send a modern laborer immediately to the emergency room.
Due to this relentless physical and environmental assault, the medieval blacksmith often faced a diminished life expectancy compared to wealthier, less physically exposed members of society, with chronic respiratory illness, systemic joint damage, and the constant threat of infection conspiring to shorten his years.
Meaning that the reward for his mastery was not a long, peaceful retirement, but a difficult, painful final decade of compromised functionality. The concept of retirement itself was almost non-existent for the vast majority of medieval craftsmen, meaning the blacksmith often had to continue his punishing work until his body simply failed, relying on the diminishing returns of his crippled body and the increasing strength of his now mastered apprentice to keep the forge fire burning and food on the table, creating a desperate, slow decline in productivity and income. As the master aged and his strength waned, he was forced to delegate more and more of the heavy, high-impact work, the main hammering, the bloom consolidation, to his apprentice or striker, relegating himself to the tasks that required more patience than power, such as the meticulous filing of lock mechanisms, the delicate tempering of blades, or the constant, grinding work of sharpening and finishing tools.
This final transition was often accompanied by a profound psychological toll, as the master craftsman, whose identity was inextricably linked to the strength of his hammer arm and the perfect rhythm of his strike, had to slowly cede physical control of his own forge.
Watching his apprentice take on the central role at the anvil, marking the undeniable, visible end of his own physical dominance and independence. The legacy of the blacksmith, therefore, was not merely the tools he left behind, but the transferred pain and knowledge he passed on to the next generation, where the apprentice, now the master, inherited not only the skills of the forge, but also the deep-seated awareness that his own body was now entering the long, brutal countdown toward the same inevitable, physical ruin. The brutality of the medieval blacksmith's life ultimately rests in this cruel paradox. He was a man who worked tirelessly to maintain the functionality of his entire community, ensuring that all their necessary tools were sharp, strong, and whole. Yet in the process, he was forced to slowly and systematically break his own body beyond repair, forging his own quiet, painful fate in the heat of his beloved fire. Having chronicled the smith's profound physical cost and his inescapable role in the profane violence of the feudal world, we now turn to his equally vital, yet often contradictory, relationship with the medieval church, recognizing that the man who mastered fire was indispensable to the sacred sphere, responsible for forging the very symbols of Christian devotion and the crucial physical architecture of spiritual authority. The blacksmith was the sole craftsman capable of creating the enduring, heavy iron crosses that crowned the spires of cathedrals, marked grave sites in cemeteries, and offered a solemn, visible focal point for village devotion,
requiring him to shift his focus from the brutal necessity of the plowshare to the meticulous, symbolic perfection demanded by the central icon of the faith.
Forging a large processional or altar cross was a complex task that demanded not only immense physical strength to work the heavy iron members, but also a keen sense of theological design, ensuring that the iron was shaped into the exact, prescribed proportions of the crucifix. often incorporating delicate decorative elements like stylized fleur-de-lis or trefoils at the terminals of the arms.
This religious commission meant the blacksmith had to carefully manage the contrast between the rough, earthy quality of the raw iron and the spiritual purity of the finished object, requiring hours of meticulous filing, grinding, and polishing to transform the sooty metal into a clean, unblemished surface worthy of representing the sacrifice and ultimate authority of the divine.
Perhaps the most massive and technologically demanding commission the medieval blacksmith undertook for the church was the creation of the great bell, which, while often cast from bronze by specialized founders, depended entirely on the smith for its colossal iron fittings, the heavy yoke, the clapper, the mounting hardware, and the complex mechanism necessary to allow the massive weight to swing rhythmically. The bell clapper itself was a testament to the smith's strength and skill, a massive, teardrop-shaped piece of wrought iron that had to be forged and tempered to withstand the thousands of high-impact blows it would deliver against the bell's inner wall over decades of use, requiring the blacksmith to shape a huge mass of steel with the absolute assurance that it would neither snap upon striking nor damage the delicate bronze of the bell. The rhythmic, deep tolling of the finished bell, which called the faithful to prayer, announced births and deaths, and warned the community of approaching danger, was entirely dependent on the structural integrity of the iron components forged in the intense heat of the blacksmith shop,
confirming that the very sound of Christian civilization was anchored in the master of the forge's heavy labor.
Furthermore, the blacksmith was tasked with creating the heavy, ornate iron grills, hinges, and protective cagework that enclosed sacred relics, guarded the treasury, or secured the massive oak doors of the cathedral against thieves and attackers, which often required him to spend weeks forging complex, interlacing patterns of iron bars, each joint meticulously hammered and forge welded to create an impenetrable yet beautiful barrier. These commissions for architectural security, particularly the construction of elaborate candelabra and lecterns, often allowed the blacksmith to demonstrate his artistic mastery, requiring him to use specialized techniques like repousse and chasing to decorative texture and fine detail to the iron surface, transforming a simple load-bearing bar into a spiraling, vegetative motif that decorated the sacred interior. The church, recognizing the unique, almost magical power the smith wielded over the element of fire, often granted the blacksmith a measure of spiritual authority within his trade, sometimes blessing the forge itself with rituals,
viewing the heat and the smoke as a metaphor for the purifying fire of purgatory or the transformative power of the divine spirit.
In a curious parallel to the myths of Wayland and Vulcan, the church sometimes used the figure of the smith to illustrate moral lessons, portraying the relentless hammering and the intense heat as a necessary purification process, drawing a direct analogy between the violent cleansing of impurities from the raw iron and the spiritual cleansing of sin from the human soul.
The blacksmith was often the maker of the specific iron tools required by the church itself, including the heavy iron book clasps that secured ancient manuscripts, the specialized chisels used by masons to shape the stone of the sanctuary,
and the heavy chains used to secure valuable books to the reading desk, ensuring that the technology of the sacred realm was entirely reliant on the smoky atmosphere of the forge. The necessity of working for the church added another layer of pressure and obligation to the smith's already crushing workload, as these sacred commissions, often tied to important feast days or the visit of a bishop, had to be completed perfectly and on time,
requiring the blacksmith to pull all-night shifts by the flickering firelight, battling his chronic exhaustion to ensure the spiritual needs of the community were met.
Thus, the medieval blacksmith stood as a true paradox, a figure often grimy, rough, and subject to the lowliest physical labor, yet simultaneously an indispensable artist and enabler of the highest forms of religious devotion and architectural grandeur, demonstrating that the brutal,
honest truth of the iron was considered worthy of standing alongside the most sublime expressions of faith. Having discussed the smith's physical strength and his role in the social fabric, we now turn to the most acute and purely intellectual brutality of his craft, which lay not in the pounding of the hammer, but in the final, life or death decision made in the quiet heat of the forge's precise moment of heat treating, where the finished iron either transformed into enduring, functional steel or instantly shattered into worthless scrap due to a single, tiny misjudgment of temperature.
This critical metallurgical step involved two distinct, but inseparable acts, hardening and tempering, processes that required the blacksmith to abandon brute force entirely and rely instead on a profound, internalized knowledge of thermal physics. forcing him to gauge molecular changes happening within the heart of the steel based only on the subtle, shifting colors revealed by the intense, glowing heat. The first step, hardening, demanded that the blacksmith heat the finished piece of sword, an axe, or a file to its critical temperature, the precise point where the carbon molecules fully dissolve into the iron crystal structure, creating a uniform solution, which was an invisible threshold that could only be judged visually by the shade of the metal, typically a bright, even cherry red or dull orange, in the perpetually dim light of the workshop. This was a task of immense pressure because if the metal were pulled out too early, it would not harden properly, remaining soft and useless. If it were left in for just a moment too long, the grain would coarsen, making the resulting steel intensely brittle and prone to catastrophic failure, requiring the smith to peer intently into the fire, trying to read the perfect moment in the shimmering glow of the iron.
Once the critical temperature was achieved, the blacksmith had mere seconds to perform the quench, plunging the white-hot object entirely and instantly into the chilling liquid, a sudden, violent thermal shock that arrested the molecular change, locking the carbon atoms into a new, incredibly hard,
strained crystalline structure known as martensite, which was the source of the steel's cutting power.
The quenching medium itself varied, sometimes being clear water, sometimes oil or brine for a less aggressive cooling rate, and occasionally strange secretive mixtures including stale urine,
which surprisingly provided consistent cooling and contained trace elements that slightly improved the steel, each choice reflecting a calculated risk against the immense stresses that threatened to warp the metal into a curved, unusable shape or snap it entirely with a terrible, high-pitched ping. If the blade survived this initial violent transformation, it emerged from the liquid incredibly hard, but also deeply brittle, existing in a state of extreme internal tension where a simple fall or a sharp knock could reduce weeks of painstaking work to fragments, forcing the blacksmith immediately into the second, calmer, yet equally nerve-wracking stage, tempering.
Tempering required the blacksmith to very gently and precisely reheat the already hardened steel to a much lower temperature, often between 200 to 400 degrees Celsius, a process too cool to be judged by the glowing color of the iron itself, forcing him instead to rely on the faint,
Shimmering oxide colors that began to creep across the polished metal surface as it reached the target temperature.
The blacksmith would watch these colors with agonizing patience, knowing that a light straw yellow indicated the perfect temper for a razor or file. A deeper blue-purple signified the ideal toughness for a spring or a flexible sword blade.
And allowing the color to darken to a pale blue meant the metal had achieved the perfect resiliency for an axe head, each shade representing a matter of a few degrees that determined the entire object's final utility and strength. This stage demanded an absolute stillness and a kind of meditative focus, where the master had to ignore the sounds and heat of the forge, concentrating entirely on the slow march of color across the steel.
And then pull the object from the heat at the exact moment the desired shade reached the critical edge, ending the process by quickly dunking it in water to freeze the color and the temper into its final, permanent state.
The sheer intellectual burden of this two-step process, judging two distinct and invisible temperatures based entirely on visual cues in a smoky environment, and knowing that a moment's inattention or a flicker of the fire could destroy the most valuable, high-carbon piece of metal in his shop created a unique, intense psychological pressure that few other medieval tradesmen had to endure. The final irony of the smith's life was that the most powerful, potentially magical part of his trade, the moment when he turned soft iron into deadly steel, required not the force of the hammer that had built his strength, but the absolute control, patience, and visual acuity that was slowly and systematically being ruined by the very environment that had granted him his mastery. Having explored the metallurgical secrets and the immense intellectual pressures of heat treating, we now settle into the unyielding, chronological truth of the blacksmith's life, tracing the long, relentless path of his working day, which stretched from the deep chill of prairie dawn twilight until long after the sun had retired, following a demanding schedule governed entirely by the unquenchable needs of the fire and the urgent demands of the surrounding feudal community. The day began long before the first hint of sun touched the horizon, requiring the master or his apprentice to rise from a brief, restless sleep, often feeling the deep cold of the early morning air as a sudden, brutal shock after the warmth radiating from the banked forge, and immediately proceeding to the vital task of stirring the slumbering coals back to life, clearing the ash, and hauling the fresh, precious charcoal into the fire pit to bring the heat up to working temperature. This crucial prairie dawn labor, which involved the heavy lifting of charcoal bags and the rhythmic pumping of the bellows in the silent darkness, was an exercise in physical dedication, ensuring that when the village finally stirred to life, the forge would already be roaring, ready to meet the urgent needs of the farmers who required immediate repair of broken tools or the fast shoeing of a horse before they departed for the fields. The morning hours were typically dedicated to this high-volume, urgent repair work, the mending of snapped chains, the reshaping of bent axes, and the constant, rapid production of nails which required the blacksmith to work with a focused, almost mechanical intensity, translating his strength into fast, repetitive hammer blows to maximize his output during the brief window before the light was sufficient for field labor. The true brutality of the smith's schedule peaked around midday, when the intense, internal heat radiating from the forge fire and the external, oppressive heat of the summer sun combined to create a truly infernal environment, forcing the master and his striker to work while perpetually drenched in sweat, battling the acute symptoms of thermal exhaustion and dehydration that threatened to compromise the fine motor control necessary for accurate striking. The meal break, if it could even be called that, was usually a short, inadequate interlude taken directly within the smoky confines of the forge itself, where the blacksmith would quickly consume a coarse meal of bread, cheese, and weak ale, sitting on an overturned barrel or a heavy log, never truly leaving the hostile atmosphere of his workplace, meaning his body and mind never achieved the true separation of rest that other tradesmen might enjoy. The food itself had to be high in carbohydrates and fats to fuel the tremendous caloric expenditure required for the non-stop heavy labor, but the relentless heat often suppressed the appetite, forcing the smith to ingest the calories he desperately needed, even when his stomach revolted against the effort, making the necessary intake of fuel another small, daily struggle against his own physiology. The afternoon and early evening hours, as the intensity of the external sun began to wane, were often reserved for the more complex, concentration-heavy projects, such as the forge welding of a delicate sword blade, the intricate filing of a lock mechanism, or the precise construction of a specialized tool, requiring the tired blacksmith to transition from explosive power to meditative focus, a shift in mental discipline that taxed his waning energy reserves. As sunset approached, casting long, deep shadows across the cluttered forge floor, the blacksmith still could not cease his labor, often having to work by the dim, flickering light of the fire itself to complete a crucial commission for the lord or a traveler passing through, forcing his already strained eyes to endure prolonged exposure to the sharp contrast between the glowing iron and the surrounding darkness, further contributing to his chronic visual impairment. The final hour of the day was dedicated to the tedious but crucial tasks of cleaning and preparation, where the exhausted smith or his apprentice swept up the heavy scale, banked the fire carefully to conserve the coals for the morning, organized the hundreds of specialized hand tools, and counted the inventory, ensuring that everything was ready to begin the unforgiving cycle again, after only a few short hours of sleep. The profound brutality of the blacksmith's rhythm lay in this unceasing cycle, the unbroken continuity of heat, noise, and physical demand that allowed no genuine moment of respite, ensuring that the chronic pain, the respiratory damage, and the immense fatigue were not merely consequences of the work, but constant, inescapable partners throughout the entirety of his waking life. After detailing the endless, consuming cycle of the blacksmith's day, we must now confront the grim statistical reality that every moment spent within the fiery confines of the forge carried a silent, terrifying contract with illness, infection, and sudden, severe injury, making the master of iron deeply vulnerable to forces that his strength, his skill, and his mastery of fire could do nothing to combat.
The most immediate and spectacular threat was the possibility of a catastrophic burn, ranging from the common, painful blister caused by a momentary lapse in attention to the devastating third-degree burns inflicted by molten slag or by accidentally grasping the wrong end of a white-hot bar, which,
in the absence of specialized medical treatment, often resulted in debilitating loss of function or, tragically, a slow, agonizing death from infection. Equally dangerous were the acute injuries caused by the tools themselves, the deep, jagged lacerations from a slipped hoof knife or a sharp chisel, the crushing damage from a poorly placed hammer blow, and the critical danger posed by tiny, high-speed metal shards that inevitably flew off the work when forging or chiseling, often lodging themselves in the unprotected eyes or embedded deep within the skin. This constant introduction of foreign material into the body, particularly the rust, carbon dust, and filth of the earthen floor, meant that every cut and every puncture wound carried a significant, almost certain risk of sepsis or tetanus, where the lack of effective sanitation or antibiotics turned a simple scratch into a lethal, system-wide infection that medieval medicine was utterly powerless to halt. Beyond the sudden dangers lay the insidious threat of chronic occupational diseases, including the aforementioned irreversible lung damage from charcoal smoke and metal dust, the pervasive, quiet onset of cataracts or blindness caused by years of staring unprotected into the intense, ultraviolet light of the white-hot iron, and the possibility of heavy metal poisoning from working with impure or specific alloys. The treatment for these injuries and illnesses was as brutal as the work itself, often relying on the limited, rudimentary practices of a village barber-surgeon or an untrained local healer, who might apply crude herbal poultices to wounds, attempt simple cauterization with a searing hot iron to stop bleeding, or, in the most desperate cases of severe limb infection, resort to the harrowing, unsanitized act of amputation. Adding to the terror was the pervasive lack of anatomical knowledge, meaning that internal injuries, such as a severe hernia caused by the immense strain of lifting heavy anvils or the relentless shock of the sledgehammer, went undiagnosed or were treated only with restrictive leather supports, forcing the blacksmith to continue working with a painful and potentially fatal internal rupture. Crucially, the blacksmith's essential role and the economic necessity of his income meant that when he was injured or ill, he rarely afforded himself the time necessary for full healing, forcing his body to struggle to mend itself while enduring the continued physical shock and contamination of the forge environment, thereby transforming temporary ailments into permanent, chronic disabilities that compounded his misery. This constant battle against the internal consequences of his external labor created a stark, terrifying irony. The man who forged the instruments of civilization was perpetually vulnerable to the very primitive forces of disease and accident, demonstrating that his mastery over the inanimate iron granted him absolutely no dominion over the fragile, easily broken nature of his own flesh and blood.
we allow this grave reality to settle gently, recognizing the profound courage required not just to face the fire, but to face the certainty of pain and the constant, nearby presence of death, a sacrifice made daily for the survival and structure of the entire medieval world.
We now focus on the relentless sonic violence inflicted upon the medieval blacksmith, acknowledging that the pervasive, constant noise of his trade was not merely an annoyance, but a source of systemic stress and an almost guaranteed path toward permanent auditory disability, turning the very rhythm of his work against his own senses.
The heart of this sonic brutality was the distinctive anvil's ring, the high-frequency, ear-piercing pain that erupted whenever the hardened face of the hammer made clean contact with the specially treated, resonant steel face of the anvil, a sound that, while often celebrated in folklore as the cheerful music of industry, was delivered at a decibel level far exceeding the point of immediate physiological harm.
This sound environment was not singular, but a cacophonous layering of high-volume trauma, which included the deep,
sustained roar of the charcoal fire being frantically fed oxygen by the pumping bellows, the sharp, violent hiss and crackle as hot iron was plunged into the quenching trough, and the heavy, dull thud of the sledgehammer wielded by the striker, all combining to create an unrelenting sonic assault that allowed the delicate inner ear no moment of recovery.
The rhythmic nature of the work, the ping-ping thud of the hammer, and the striker, which was crucial for controlling the heat and shaping the metal, paradoxically ensured that the ear was subjected to constant, predictable shock waves, leading to the rapid destruction of the tiny, sensitive hair cells within the cochlea, which were simply overwhelmed by the relentless, crushing energy of the high-frequency impact. The inevitable consequence of this lifelong exposure was the onset of chronic tinnitus, a perpetual, high-pitched ringing or buzzing sound that afflicted the blacksmith even in the deepest quiet of the night, acting as a constant, intrusive reminder of the day's labor and serving as the first,
irreversible sign of the eventual profound deafness that awaited him in his later years.
This deteriorating ability to hear created a profound sense of isolation, forcing the blacksmith, whose communication was already limited by his soiled appearance and his solitary dedication to the forge, to withdraw further from society, often mishearing instructions, missing details of village gossip, and finding true conversation outside the noisy environment of his shop frustrating and exhausting. The physical need to compensate for the hearing loss meant the blacksmith was often perceived as shouting or being perpetually aggressive in normal conversation, speaking in the loud tones necessary to overcome the roaring fire and the ringing hammer,
creating an unfortunate social barrier that added emotional brutality to his physical suffering. Furthermore, the need to listen closely to the sound of the forging itself to hear the subtle change in the metal's ring that indicated a drop in temperature or a failure in the weld meant a blacksmith could not simply block out the noise,
as his very livelihood depended on his capacity to discriminate fine auditory details within the overwhelming roar, placing his hearing health in direct conflict with the requirements of his mastery.
The final tragedy of this sonic exposure was that the profound silence of his later life, the peaceful stillness that should have been the reward for his noisy toil, was itself ruined by the internal ringing of his damaged ears and the inability to reconnect with the world through conversation,
ensuring that the legacy of his powerful, rhythmic hammer was ultimately a quiet, lonely physical withdrawal.
Having detailed the master blacksmith's chronic suffering and the slow degradation of his body, we must now trace the origins of this painful existence back to the apprentice, the young boy whose first years in the forge were defined by a profound, immediate brutality, a systematic, 7-year submission of his youthful strength and will to the master's absolute authority and the furnace's unyielding demands.
The apprenticeship was formalized by a lengthy indenture contract, a legal document that bound the boy entirely to the master, often for a period extending 7 years or more, during which time the apprentice was required to provide unwavering obedience and ceaseless labor in exchange for food, lodging, and the gradual, highly controlled instruction in the secrets of the forge, making the boy a form of temporary, valuable property.
The initial tasks assigned to the frightened, soot-faced boy were not about the artistic shaping of metal, but about pure, repetitive, back-breaking maintenance, foremost among these being the exhausting, endless necessity of manually operating the great bellows, which required him to stand for hours on end,
relentlessly pushing the air into the fire pit to maintain the 1,000-degree temperatures necessary for work. This monotonous, physical labor, the hauling of heavy sacks of coarse charcoal from the storage shed, the endless fetching of water for the quench trough, and the continuous sweeping and sifting of the hot, dangerous scale and ash from the floor was specifically designed to strip the boy of his childish energy and instill the unwavering endurance and obedience required for a lifetime spent in the service of fire. The apprentice lived in a constant state of acute physical fear, not only of the searing heat, the sparks, and the risk of catastrophic injury from the unfamiliar, massive tools, but also of the master's strict and immediate discipline, knowing that a moment's inattention, a wasted piece of precious iron, or a failure to maintain the fire's intensity could earn him a harsh, physical reprimand that was fully supported by the customs of the age.
As the boy grew and his muscles hardened, his role evolved into the position of striker, where he transitioned from the monotonous labor of the bellows to the explosive, immense power of the sledgehammer, standing opposite the master and delivering precisely aimed, synchronized blows to the iron,
forcing his young body to absorb and deliver bone-jarring impact shock for hours on end. This shift to the striker position While a sign of progress, was arguably the most physically taxing phase of the entire apprenticeship, demanding maximum output from his still developing frame, placing severe, lasting strain on his joints, spine, and internal musculature, and ensuring that the physical degradation that defined the master's later years began its insidious work decades earlier in a young apprentice. Despite the fear and the exhaustion, the apprenticeship was also a time of intense, focused learning, where the boy gradually memorized the subtle language of the forge, learning to identify the precise colors of the heat, to distinguish the tones of the different hammer strikes, and to anticipate the complex needs and movements of the master with an almost telepathic speed, recognizing that this knowledge was his only path to eventual freedom and mastery. After years of relentless servitude and accumulated scarring, the successful apprentice was eventually released to become a journeyman, free to travel and work for wages, or, after presenting a successful masterpiece and paying a substantial fee to the guild, finally elevate himself to the rank of master, where he could open his own forge and, tragically, begin the cycle anew by taking on an apprentice of his own. The true, unromanticized burden of the blacksmith's apprentice lay in this profound contract, exchanging 7 years of painful, total physical and psychological subjugation for the immense, invaluable knowledge of fire and iron, accepting that his initial brutality was a necessary crucible that would ultimately grant him the power to shape the very foundation of the medieval world. We now turn our attention fully to the profound, enduring result of all that suffering, the final, cool piece of ironwork, which often survived the destruction of the wood and stone around it, standing as the only honest, timeless testament to the blacksmith's immense effort and his singular mastery over the material world. The true aesthetics of medieval ironwork were inherently rooted in its functional perfection, recognizing that a perfectly balanced hinge that swung without catching, a lock mechanism that operated with smooth, satisfying certainty, or a plowshare that held a razor edge against the abrasive soil, possessed an intrinsic beauty far surpassing any purely decorative element. The supreme skill of the master was demonstrated by the ability to move beyond mere function, creating elaborate architectural ironwork that adorned the massive doors of cathedrals, the ornate security screens around altars, and the detailed grilles of public buildings, requiring him to forge heavy bars into delicate, spiraling vines, intricate trefoils, and stylized vegetative patterns that seemed to defy the metal's inherent hardness. These intricate, decorative flourishes demanded the application of techniques like collaring, where thin bands of metal were wrapped tightly around forged joints to secure them without the need for visible welding, and drawing out, where the master expertly tapered the ends of heavy bars into fine, elegant points, creating an illusion of lightness and fragility that contrasted beautifully with the material's true, unyielding strength. Even on the most utilitarian objects, the blacksmith often left subtle, almost subconscious evidence of his personal touch, known as the signature mark or touchmark, a unique pattern of file strokes, a particular style of hammer finish, or occasionally, a proprietary stamp burned deep into the finished iron that served as the maker's unspoken guarantee of quality and a claim to the piece's history. This touchmark, which might be a small geometric symbol, a stylized initial, or a representation of the smith's patron saint, was the quiet, enduring voice of the blacksmith, ensuring that even centuries later, the meticulous work of his scarred hands could be traced and recognized, giving the maker a form of lasting, physical immortality that was denied to the peasant whose work dissolved with the seasons. The high value placed on this permanence meant that the medieval smith developed specific expertise in crafting objects designed to withstand the ravages of time and the elements, particularly the weather vanes and roof finials that sat exposed to constant wind and rain, which required specialized welding and robust structural design to ensure they would remain perfectly balanced and securely fixed to the highest point of the structure for generations. The final brilliance of the finished product lay in the flawless surface quality, which required the blacksmith to painstakingly grind and polish the piece, often using sandstone wheels or heavy files, to remove the rough, oxidized black scale and reveal the clean, smooth grey sheen of the wrought iron beneath, a physically demanding, often dusty task that marked the final separation of the functional object from the fiery chaos of its creation. The true, unromanticized art of the forge, therefore, lay in the systematic, repetitive pursuit of perfection, recognizing that the final, Seemingly effortless beauty of a finished lock or a flowing decorative hinge was achieved only by rigorously repeating the brutal cycles of heating, hammering,
and normalizing until the molecular structure of the iron itself was flawless, ensuring that the finished product would never fail its intended purpose. We recognize that the enduring legacy of the medieval blacksmith is not just a collection of rusty relics, but a testament to the fact that immense, persistent physical effort, when guided by profound knowledge and a commitment to quality, can transform the raw,
chaotic elements of the earth into objects of both necessity and timeless beauty, offering a quiet, powerful echo of his toil across the centuries.
After admiring the enduring beauty of the finished ironwork, we must now descend into the murky, demanding origins of the blacksmith's material, confronting the often overlooked brutality of the primitive supply chain, which began with the raw, impure or extracted from the unforgiving earth and required a massive, coordinated effort before the master could ever strike a hammer on clean metal. For much of the medieval period, the readily available source of iron was often bulk iron, a sedimentary ore deposited in swamps and marshes by oxidizing bacteria,
requiring farmers or specialized gatherers to wade into muddy wetlands, performing the backbreaking, tedious labor of digging and scraping up the rust-colored, impure material, emphasizing the messy, low-grade quality of the earth's initial offering. This raw ore then had to be painstakingly sorted, cleaned, and often crushed by hand,
removing as much of the attached rock, clay, and organic matter as possible. A slow, meticulous preparatory task that consumed immense amounts of human energy simply to ready the material for the most crucial and transformative stage.
The initial smelting within the primitive furnace known as the bloomery. The operation of the bloomery was itself a monumental, continuous feat of physical endurance, demanding the construction of a tall, rudimentary clay or stone furnace, and requiring a team of smelters to work for many hours, sometimes even days,
loading alternating layers of the precious charcoal fuel and the prepared iron ore into the shaft while relentlessly pumping large bellows to maintain the intense, sustained heat necessary to chemically reduce the ore. This early smelting process, which could reach temperatures exceeding $1,200 but was still insufficient to fully liquefy the iron, was a brutal and wasteful affair, as approximately 90% of those mass, the non-metallic slag and various impurities, was discarded, leaving behind a semi-solid, porous mass of impure iron known as the bloom,
which had to be immediately dealt with while still hot. The extraction of this massive, flowing bloom from the bottom of the furnace was an incredibly hazardous and physically taxing operation, requiring the smelters to use long, heavy tongs and levers to pull the spongy, white-hot lump of iron,
often weighing hundreds of pounds, from the heart of the furnace and drag it immediately to a massive stone or wooden block for the first necessary act of consolidation. This initial consolidation was a raw, primal form of forging, demanding that the smelters or the smith use their heaviest sledgehammers to pound the still glowing bloom repeatedly and violently, forcing the semi-liquid slag to ooze out from the porous iron mass,
a showering fountain of dangerous, molten waste that required sustained, overwhelming effort to reduce the spongy mass into a denser, workable billet of iron. The blacksmith often had to perform this consolidation himself, recognizing that the wrought iron he received, even after this initial processing, was still highly heterogeneous, containing streaks of slag and uneven carbon distribution, forcing him to repeatedly reheat, hammer, and fold the billet in the early stages of a project to mechanically drive out the remaining imperfections, adding immense
foundation labor to his already crushing schedule. The true economic brutality of the entire process lay in this profound waste and inefficiency, where the sheer volume of fuel and manual labor consumed to produce a single, small piece of usable wrought iron was staggering, reinforcing the immense value of every finished piece the smith created, and placing a crushing financial pressure on the master to ensure that not a single hammer stroke was wasted. Having uncovered the immense physical and material cost required to transform raw bulk iron into a workable bloom, we now turn our focus to the economic landscape that determined the blacksmith's survival, recognizing that his financial existence was a precarious balance of high demand and crushing vulnerability, often leaving him burdened by debt and constantly fighting against the strict, unforgiving constraints of the medieval market.
The blacksmith operated under the immense economic pressure of high overhead, as the essential materials of his trade, the massive quantities of charcoal and the hard-won wrought iron represented such significant capital-intensive investments that a single failed weld, a cracked blade during quenching,
or a mistake that ruined a large piece of stock could represent a genuine financial catastrophe for his entire family.
Unlike the simple peasant who owned only his labor and the food he produced, the master smith required a constant flow of cash or credit to sustain his operation, needing funds not just for raw materials, but also for the purchase of specialized tools,
the wages or maintenance of his apprentices, and the constant repairs to his forge structure and equipment, all of which placed him in a state of chronic, low-level financial anxiety.
The pricing of his products was rarely a matter of simple free market exchange, especially in the early feudal period, as the cost of essential goods like plowshares and horseshoes was often regulated by the feudal lord or fixed by the restrictive rules of the local guild, ensuring that the smith received a fair, but often rigidly limited, profit margin that prevented him from accumulating significant wealth. This economic control meant that while his skill was highly valued and always in demand, the blacksmith was frequently paid in kind rather than in coin, receiving grain, livestock, or services in exchange for his ironwork,
requiring him to maintain complex ledgers and become a meticulous barterer just to ensure that the diverse needs of his household were met, a necessity that added administrative complexity to his intense physical labor.
The constant need for materials meant the smith often found himself in a perpetual state of debt to merchants who supplied his charcoal or to the local lord who provided access to iron or wood, creating a financial subservience that tethered him to the local power structure almost as securely as a feudal bond, limiting his ability to move his operation or seek higher prices in a more lucrative market. Furthermore, the blacksmith had to contend with the devastating financial impact of accidents and natural calamities, knowing that the destruction of his forge by an accidental fire a constant, terrifying possibility in a workshop full of dry wood and hot coals could instantly wipe out years of investment and labor, leaving him professionally ruined with nowhere to turn for immediate, large-scale financial recovery. The guilds, while offering some protection in terms of setting quality standards and providing a limited form of social safety net, primarily functioned as restrictive monopolies that dictated the maximum number of apprentices he could train and the specific techniques he was allowed to use,
thereby artificially restraining the production volume and ensuring that the market, while profitable, never allowed for explosive entrepreneurial growth.
The greatest financial security the blacksmith possessed lay in the permanence and necessity of his product, knowing that iron did not spoil, and that the fundamental tools he produced, the axes, the hinges, the fasteners, would always be required by every single member of the community, which granted him a stability of employment that was the envy of many other trades, despite the inherent brutality of the work itself. This precarious balance between immense physical effort, high capital cost, and regulated pricing defined the true economic brutality of the blacksmith's life. He was rich in skill and essential to society, yet poor in accumulated savings, and constantly one catastrophic accident away from financial ruin, forced to rely entirely on the steady, rhythmic output of his hammer to maintain his fragile solvency.
After detailing the master blacksmith's immense economic vulnerability and his continuous fight against the high cost of materials, we now confront a final, inescapable layer of his daily brutality, the pervasive, continuous presence of waste products, which were the heavy, unwanted physical remnants of his fiery creation, demanding constant,
arduous labor simply for their disposal and threatening the very safety and function of his workspace. The most significant and physically demanding byproduct was slag or cinder, the glassy, vitrified residue left over from the initial smelting of ore and the continuous hammer welding of iron, which represented the heavy, unwanted impurities that had been violently hammered out of the metal, and which accumulated in massive,
dense piles both within and surrounding the forge structure. Dealing with this immense volume of heavy, sharp, and often still hot slag was a perpetual, back-breaking chore, requiring the apprentice or the master to shovel and haul the useless, high-density material away from the anvil block and the fire pit, preventing the dangerous, uneven build-up that could cause a loss of footing or contaminate the work area. This continuous need for waste removal was compounded by the fact that the slag could not simply be left near the forge, as its high iron content meant it was often recycled by less scrupulous or desperate smelters, or was sometimes used as a rough,
durable filler for paving muddy paths or building low walls, adding the exhausting task of transportation and negotiation for its eventual destination to the blacksmith's already overfull schedule. In addition to the glassy, dense slag, the fort produced vast quantities of fine, light charcoal ash, the powdery white residue of the immense fuel consumption, which, while visually less imposing than the slag, was a constant, airborne irritant that coated every surface, contributed to the dangerous smoke inhalation,
and had to be meticulously sifted and cleared from the fire pit multiple times a day.
The sheer volume of cinders and scale the flakes of iron oxide that constantly shed from the hot metal under the hammer meant that the floor of the forge was perpetually contaminated, forcing the blacksmith to continually sweep and manage the debris, not just for cleanliness, but to prevent these tiny, sharp,
oxidized flakes from contaminating a clean piece of work or, more dangerously, being tracked into the family's living space.
The need to maintain a clear, relatively smooth working area meant the master often had to periodically shut down his operation to perform a major muck-out, requiring days of sustained, heavy lifting and digging to remove the massive,
compacted build-up of slag and ash that had fused into the earthen floor beneath the anvil, a task that represented a significant, non-productive interruption to his essential income.
The disposal of this waste was not merely a matter of tidiness.
It was a matter of health and safety, as the slag's sharp edges posed a risk of severe lacerations, and the fine dust contributed to the chronic respiratory illness, forcing the master to accept the fact that his essential power over iron also made his forge a continuously self-polluting, messy,
and inherently unhealthy environment.
Even the necessary byproduct of the quench tank, which quickly became a murky, black mixture of water, oil, metallic dust, and chemical residues, posed a disposal problem, requiring a heavy, foul-smelling liquid to be laboriously hauled out and dumped away from the main water source, adding to the list of constant, unpleasant, and physically demanding chores that define the perimeter of the master's fiery craft. We recognize that the true, unromanticized environmental brutality of the blacksmith's life lay in this unending, thankless labor of managing his own industrial waste, a constant, low-grade physical drain that confirmed the reality that for every beautiful, functional object he created, he simultaneously manufactured a heavy,
useless pile of earth's stubborn refusal.
After detailing the grueling physical burden of waste disposal, we now elevate our focus to the intellectual sphere of the blacksmith's existence, recognizing that his knowledge, the precise, hard-won understanding of metallurgy, temperature, and technique was his most valuable and most vulnerable asset, transmitted not through dusty tomes but through the intimate,
highly controlled medium of oral tradition and guarded secrets. The medieval blacksmith's library was housed entirely within his memory, and the memory of his master, consisting of countless recipes for specific alloys, the precise color temperature scales for hardening different grades of steel, the proprietary methods for crafting complex warded locks, and the vital, secret mixtures for specialized quenching baths,
all passed down through careful observation and whispered instruction across the ringing anvil.
Within the various guilds, this collective wisdom was often codified into specific, elaborate rituals and secret codes, which served as a form of social and economic gatekeeping, ensuring that only those who had undergone the full, physical, and financial commitment of the apprenticeship could access the collective technical knowledge that allowed them to produce the highest quality, most valuable work.
The mastery of this unwritten curriculum required the apprentice to possess a profound capacity for memory, attention to detail, and a near-perfect mimicry, making the intellectual process just as demanding as the physical labor, as he had to simultaneously retain complex formulae while enduring the deafening noise, the blinding heat,
and the constant physical exhaustion of the shop floor.
This reliance on memory also introduced a severe vulnerability, as the accidental death or crippling injury of a master could instantly sever the unbroken chain of technical knowledge, meaning that specific, localized metallurgical secrets, perhaps the optimal carbon content for a unique tool or a complex welding technique, could be lost forever, forcing the next generation to painfully rediscover the lost art through trial and catastrophic error.
The touchmark or signature stamp that the master placed upon his finished work served as a subtle, physical articulation of this intellectual heritage, communicating to the market not just who made the object, but that it was produced by a man who possessed the legitimate, guild-sanctioned knowledge passed down through generations of fire-tested expertise, guaranteeing its reliability.
We must recognize that the deepest, quietest brutality of the forge was this continuous, high-stakes pressure to retain and transmit this invaluable, invisible library, forcing the master to be not only a manual laborer, but also a demanding teacher,
and the apprentice to be not only a muscle, but a dedicated, flawless student, all while battling the heat and the constant threat of noise-induced distraction.
We allow the image of a hand passing a glowing piece of iron, rather than a book, from master to student to settle in our minds, recognizing that the very heat of the metal was the true medium of their learning,
and the precise timing of the hammer strike was the eloquent language of their instruction.